Leaders.
American capitalism. Artificial exuberance. A searing market rally brings new risks.
Since America elected Donald Trump as president on November 5th, the value of its listed firms has increased by $4.2 trillion, more than the entire worth of London's stock market. The S&P 500 is up by nearly 30% this year. At 23 times its forward earnings, the index has rarely been so highly rated by investors. Nor, in recent years, have its constituents been able to borrow more cheaply. The cost for risky companies of raising funds is at its lowest relative to Treasury bonds since the spring of 2007. Everywhere you look, there are signs of exuberance. This month, the price of Bitcoin reached $100,000, and all this is happening despite positive real interest rates. What is going on? A familiar part of the explanation is that American technological innovation has made investors giddy. No two businessmen exemplify the boom better than Jensen Huang, whose firm sells artificial intelligence or AI chips, and Elon Musk, who makes electric vehicles and rockets, and will be part of Mr. Trump's administration. Their two firms, Nvidia and Tesla, are part of the Magnificent Seven, which now account for a third of the S&P 500's market value and a quarter of its profits, an extraordinary degree of concentration. Less remarked upon, however, is the wave of financial innovation that is underway and which brings new risks. The Schumpeterian urge burns as hot among the country's financial engineers as it does for those who build real things. Exchange-traded funds, or ETFs, for instance, have accelerated their decades-long rise. Those listed in America now manage $11 trillion worth of assets and come in increasingly speculative forms. Investors can now buy ETFs that provide leveraged exposure to Nvidia and Tesla, or even MicroStrategy, a software firm raising billions to purchase Bitcoin, whose share price has shot up by around 500% this year. The structural changes taking place in private markets are no less dramatic. On average, share prices in the three biggest private markets firms have risen by more than those of the Magnificent Seven this year. Private credit providers are nosing into lending markets once dominated by banks, often funding investments with life insurance policies. A Cambrian explosion of products for individual investors is underway. Their architects are not bankers. Quant firms, such as Jane Street, are minting fortunes, making markets in ETFs. The popularity of such low-cost investment products has squeezed active portfolio managers. Survivors have migrated to huge multi-manager hedge funds, such as Citadel and Millennium. BlackRock, dominant in public markets, is targeting private ones. This month it agreed to buy HPS, a lender. Apollo, a private markets firm with a big insurance arm, is moving the other way. It plans to launch a private credit ETF. Investors buying the most speculative new products are likely to end up disappointed. Firms consolidating the private credit industry today risk doing so at the top of the market. What matters more is the risk this rapid innovation poses to the broader financial system. Regulators face at least a dozen growing non-bank institutions which, on the basis of their size, novelty, opacity, and interconnectedness, may be deemed systemically important. Some of these companies may indeed efficiently shift risk away from the banking system, which is always vulnerable to runs by depositors. But deciding which of them strengthen the system in this way, and which pose new unacceptable and poorly understood threats, is the most urgent question in financial regulation today. That may not be a priority for Mr. Trump, whose interest in regulation, appears to centre on lifting rules for the crypto industry. Yet today's sky-high asset prices lend the task urgency. Markets show signs of becoming more fragile. In August, the VIX, a measure of stock market volatility, recorded its biggest ever one-day spike as hedge funds unwound highly leveraged currency trades. Equity investors react more and faster to company earnings than they used to. In debt markets, reports from business development companies, a type of investment vehicle, indicate plenty of sloppy lending in private credit. Some investors acknowledge that returns in years to come may be lower, but many are too sanguine about the risk of a market crash. Although volatility has returned to normal and default expectations are benign, minds could change quickly. Imagine that one of America's tech champions suddenly issues a gloomy outlook, and that financial innovators also turn out to have misunderstood the risk contained in their new products. Markets would be falling from a very great height.
Leaders.
American capitalism. Artificial exuberance. A searing market rally brings new risks.
Since America elected Donald Trump as president on November 5th, the value of its listed firms has increased by $4.2 trillion, more than the entire worth of London's stock market. The S&P 500 is up by nearly 30% this year. At 23 times its forward earnings, the index has rarely been so highly rated by investors. Nor, in recent years, have its constituents been able to borrow more cheaply. The cost for risky companies of raising funds is at its lowest relative to Treasury bonds since the spring of 2007. Everywhere you look, there are signs of exuberance. This month, the price of Bitcoin reached $100,000, and all this is happening despite positive real interest rates. What is going on? A familiar part of the explanation is that American technological innovation has made investors giddy. No two businessmen exemplify the boom better than Jensen Huang, whose firm sells artificial intelligence or AI chips, and Elon Musk, who makes electric vehicles and rockets, and will be part of Mr. Trump's administration. Their two firms, Nvidia and Tesla, are part of the Magnificent Seven, which now account for a third of the S&P 500's market value and a quarter of its profits, an extraordinary degree of concentration. Less remarked upon, however, is the wave of financial innovation that is underway and which brings new risks. The Schumpeterian urge burns as hot among the country's financial engineers as it does for those who build real things. Exchange-traded funds, or ETFs, for instance, have accelerated their decades-long rise. Those listed in America now manage $11 trillion worth of assets and come in increasingly speculative forms. Investors can now buy ETFs that provide leveraged exposure to Nvidia and Tesla, or even MicroStrategy, a software firm raising billions to purchase Bitcoin, whose share price has shot up by around 500% this year. The structural changes taking place in private markets are no less dramatic. On average, share prices in the three biggest private markets firms have risen by more than those of the Magnificent Seven this year. Private credit providers are nosing into lending markets once dominated by banks, often funding investments with life insurance policies. A Cambrian explosion of products for individual investors is underway. Their architects are not bankers. Quant firms, such as Jane Street, are minting fortunes, making markets in ETFs. The popularity of such low-cost investment products has squeezed active portfolio managers. Survivors have migrated to huge multi-manager hedge funds, such as Citadel and Millennium. BlackRock, dominant in public markets, is targeting private ones. This month it agreed to buy HPS, a lender. Apollo, a private markets firm with a big insurance arm, is moving the other way. It plans to launch a private credit ETF. Investors buying the most speculative new products are likely to end up disappointed. Firms consolidating the private credit industry today risk doing so at the top of the market. What matters more is the risk this rapid innovation poses to the broader financial system. Regulators face at least a dozen growing non-bank institutions, which, on the basis of their size, novelty, opacity, and interconnectedness, may be deemed systemically important. Some of these companies may indeed efficiently shift risk away from the banking system, which is always vulnerable to runs by depositors. But deciding which of them strengthen the system in this way, and which pose new unacceptable and poorly understood threats, is the most urgent question in financial regulation today. That may not be a priority for Mr. Trump, whose interest in regulation appears to center on lifting rules for the crypto industry. Yet today's sky-high asset prices lend the task urgency. Markets show signs of becoming more fragile. In August, the VIX, a measure of stock market volatility, recorded its biggest ever one-day spike as hedge funds unwound highly leveraged currency trades. Equity investors react more and faster to company earnings than they used to. In debt markets, reports from business development companies, a type of investment vehicle, indicate plenty of sloppy lending in private credit. Some investors acknowledge that returns in years to come may be lower, but many are too sanguine about the risk of a market crash. Although volatility has returned to normal and default expectations are benign, minds could change quickly. Imagine that one of America's tech champions suddenly issues a gloomy outlook, and that financial innovators also turn out to have misunderstood the risk contained in their new products. Markets would be falling from a very great height.
Europe. Ukraine's nuclear plants. Uncertain reaction. Plans for new reactors may not solve energy woes.
Russian missiles have knocked out roughly half of Ukraine's pre-war electricity generation capacity. But because Russia has refrained from blowing up nuclear reactors, nearly 60% of Ukraine's electricity production is currently nuclear, even though the country's and Europe's biggest plant in Zaporizhzhia was occupied by Russia in 2022 and is now shut down. Without nuclear reactors, says German Galushenko, the energy minister, Ukraine's grid would not survive. In what would be a first for a country under assault, Ukraine now aims to install more of them. Initial construction has begun. At Khmelnytsky, a plant in western Ukraine with 2 existing reactors, connections are being built to a shovel-ready area where 4 more reactors are planned, says Elias Gedeon of Westinghouse, an American partner on the project. Westinghouse is to provide 2 reactors. The other 2 of Russian design are to be purchased for $600 million or so from Bulgaria, where they were mothballed after a project fell apart in 2012. Haggling continues, but Mr. Galushenko says Russian meddling in Bulgaria has so far failed to scuttle the deal. Boosters say the project can move quickly. The reactors in Bulgaria are of the same type already operating in Khmelnytsky, and structures to house them were partially built in the 1980s. Mr. Galushenko reckons the first one could be fired up in 3 years, though that may be optimistic. Adding reactors will clearly not solve Ukraine's immediate energy crunch. Victoria Wojcicka, a former member of the Energy Committee of Ukraine's parliament, fears that without more power, 1.5 million more Ukrainians might flee abroad this winter. She thinks the money would be better spent on networks of small gas-fired plants and other kit harder for Russia to destroy. Others worry that building a nuclear project will tempt Russia to attack it. Andriy Zyuz, ex-chief of staff at Ukraine's National Security and Defense Council, fears Russia would hammer the construction site before nuclear fuel is brought in. Russia has blown up high-voltage substations connected to nuclear plants, which could theoretically trigger an accident. Mikhailo Gonchar of the Center for Global Studies Strategy 21, an energy think tank in Kiev, argues this shows that the Kremlin cares more about destroying Ukraine than about any harm such attacks do to its reputation. Mr. Zyuz says the conflict has reduced Ukraine's skilled nuclear workforce to a troubling level. The reliability of the Bulgarian reactors is another question, as is the availability of spare parts, which Ukraine will not obtain from Russia. Then there is the cost. Ina Sovsun, an MP on the Energy Committee, slams the government for providing outdated estimates from a 2018 study involving a slightly different reactor type. One reason, she says, why Parliament has yet to give its approval. Whether nuclear power is a logical solution to Ukraine's energy problems can be debated, but its strategists may have something else in mind. James Acton of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, an American think tank, wonders whether the country is trying to bring in Westinghouse reactors and American engineers to give its ally another reason to prevent a takeover by Russia.
Middle East and Africa.
Israel's Prime Minister. Back in the dock. As Benjamin Netanyahu fights charges of corruption, democracy may suffer.
The small but noisy groups of protesters shouting at each other outside the Tel Aviv District Court on December 10th agreed on one thing. It was absurd for the man running a country with wars on several fronts to spend 3 days a week in court defending himself against complex corruption charges. Critics of Benjamin Netanyahu, Israel's first-serving prime minister to appear as a witness in his own defense in a criminal trial, think he should resign and face his manifold legal challenges as an ordinary citizen. His supporters, however, are convinced he is indispensable. They consider the whole case a witch hunt that should be cooled off. As for Mr. Netanyahu, in recent weeks he has tried in vain to get a security assessment that it was dangerous for him to attend court at fixed times in the same place. Then he said he had too little time to prepare his testimony. Finally, he denied ever having tried to delay the show. "I've waited 8 years for this moment," he told the court. "I'm a marathon runner who can prevail with 20 kilograms on my back." The investigations into Mr. Netanyahu's affairs began in 2016. Charges of fraud and bribe-taking were laid against him 5 years ago. He is accused of accepting illicit gifts from rich benefactors and colluding with media barons to get favourable coverage. He strenuously denies all the charges. At the start of his testimony, Mr. Netanyahu claimed that what the media say about him is not really important, then went on to explain in detail how journalism in Israel works, and defended his meetings with publishers and editors to influence journalistic appointments. The case has dragged on so long for many reasons, including COVID-19, the war against Hamas since October 7, 2023, delaying tactics by Mr. Netanyahu's defense team, and the slow pace of Israel's courts. Judges are overloaded, partly because Mr. Netanyahu's coalition has tried to change the judicial appointment system, and having failed to do so, has been obstructing the existing process. Mr. Netanyahu's legal travails have been responsible for forcing the country to hold 5 elections in 4 years, as centrist parties have refused to join a government led by an indicted prime minister. In 2021, he lost power for 18 months, but came back at the end of 2022 with a coalition supported by far-right and religious parties that share his hostility to Israel's courts. The ambitious judicial reforms that he promoted last year aimed to weaken the Supreme Court and independent legal counsel to government, but were largely stymied by a massive wave of protest. They were then dropped in the name of national unity after last year's war in Gaza began. But in recent months, his government has restarted the campaign to increase control of parts of the state. This includes laws now going through the Knesset, Israel's parliament, that would let politicians fire the Attorney General and control the appointments of the Commissioner of the Civil Service and of the Ombudsman investigating complaints against judges. Other laws would grant members of Parliament virtual immunity from investigation and would defund or privatise Israel's stubbornly independent broadcasting corporation. In his autobiography in 2022, Mr. Netanyahu says he has always been a staunch believer in liberal democracy and been immersed since my teens in its classical texts. That assertion may be tested under cross-examination by the prosecution. Mr. Netanyahu is the first of many witnesses for the defense. It could be years before a verdict is reached. But Israel's courts have held Israeli leaders to account before. Ehud Olmert, a former prime minister, was jailed for bribery. Mr. Netanyahu is determined to avoid that fate, but by clinging to power by every means, he may undermine Israel's democracy.
Leaders.
Brain drain. Can you read as well as a 10-year-old? Adults in rich countries are less literate than they were a decade ago. That requires attention.
Does it often feel as if the world is getting stupider? Data released on December 10th by the OECD, a club of mostly rich countries, suggests this may not be all in your head. Roughly every 10 years, the organisation asks adults in dozens of places to sit tests in numeracy and literacy. The questions it poses are not abstract brain teasers, spelling tests or mental arithmetic. They aim to mimic problems people aged 16 to 65 face in daily life, whether they are working in a factory or an office, or simply trying to make sense of the news. The latest tests were carried out in 31 rich countries, and their findings are unnerving. They suggest that a fifth of adults do no better in maths and reading than might be expected of a primary school child. The direction of travel is even less encouraging. In maths, average scores have risen in a few places over the past 10 years, but fallen in almost as many. In literacy, a lot more countries have seen scores decline than advance, despite the fact that adults hold more and higher educational qualifications than ever before. Demographic change offers some explanation. New immigrants often struggle with a new language. The native-born have aging brains. But even after adjusting for this, trends remain gloomy, especially in literacy. Some speculate that Netflix, video games and social media are sapping acuity. It is just as likely that education and training systems have misfired. These disappointing results deserve more attention than they are likely to get. Basic numeracy and literacy are oddly unfashionable causes, especially when adults lack them. Students of education prefer to debate how to teach fashionable soft skills. Hype around generative artificial intelligence doesn't help. Harping on about the importance of times tables seems even more fuddy-duddy when talking robots promise to do all the hard work. Yet a century of technological upheaval has not cut demand for people who are good with numbers or who have a way with words. Adults who do badly in the OECD's tests earn vastly less than those who ace them. They are also in poorer health, less satisfied with their life, less trusting of others, and more likely to feel that they have no voice in politics. In many countries, the gap in ability between the highest and lowest skilled grown-ups is widening, not because smarty pants are doing better, but because the least able are doing worse. Writ large, such trends lead nowhere good. What to do? Improving lessons for children is the surest way of creating more capable grown-ups. Governments ought to start there. England's adults have crept up the OECD's league table, mostly because the youngest ones, aged 16 to 24, are scoring better than before. That may reflect reforms which have made exams for older teenagers more difficult and begun requiring youngsters who fail them to try again. In America, which has done fairly badly, states are junking tests that were in the past used to determine who graduated from high school. Grades there are inflating unchecked. The second task is to oil creaking systems for educating adults. These hand dropouts second chances. They also serve people who change careers and help migrants integrate. Yet politicians grant them paltry budgets, in part because they underestimate the trickiness of what they are being asked to accomplish. People with the weakest skills tend to have the least time and money for self-improvement. They are less likely to attend adult classes or get training, even though they are the most in need. In too many places, a mania for universities has sapped funding and focus from all the other kinds of lessons that people aged 18 and above could be offered. Degrees are becoming less meaningful. The OECD has found that even some university graduates post numeracy and literacy scores that might embarrass a child. Meanwhile, oldies who want to return to class without embarking on long, expensive university courses often find good alternatives are lacking. Accelerating efforts to fix all these problems seems like a bright idea.
China.
Entertainment. Too much drama. The government cracks down on karate chopping maids.
"How did this cleaning lady steal everything from me? I'll kill her," yells the villainous Miss Wang in Cleaning Mom, The Return of the Infinite, a soap opera released in October. In the finale, the titular heroine knocks Miss Wang out with a karate chop, and then, spoiler alert, marries a millionaire who is young enough to be her son. So ends a storyline featuring multiple betrayals and knife attacks. It unfolds at a frenzied pace over 36 two-minute episodes. Microdramas, as this type of entertainment is known, are wildly popular in China. They are typically made on shoestring budgets. Yet some have been watched over 1 billion times, according to Kuaishou, a mobile phone app which streams them. The first few episodes of a microdrama are usually free. Viewers then have to pay or watch adverts to unlock the rest. Between 2021 and 2023, the market for microdramas grew tenfold to 37.4 billion yuan, that's $5.3 billion. It could be worth 100 billion yuan by 2027, projects II Media Research, a data provider. The Chinese authorities, though, think some microdramas are sending the wrong message. Officials dislike a popular trope where someone of humble background marries into wealth and power. Such fantasies are at odds with Communist Party ideology, which extols grit. China's leader Xi Jinping has said happiness is earned through struggle. On November 22nd, China's regulators released a notice banning microdramas that use this trope or otherwise depict people getting something for nothing. Such shows deviate from mainstream values and are often excessively entertaining, the notice said. Microdramas should instead focus on wholesome themes, such as the value of hard work and communities living in harmony, say regulators. China's state-run media have picked out a show called The Story of Suzhou for praise. It follows a group of young people working to protect the cultural heritage of Suzhou, a city in the east. Is it necessary to redesign the traffic system in the Old Town? Asks a character at one point. The show is not excessively entertaining. A few rags-to-riches microdramas, including Cleaning Mom, have already been removed from streaming platforms by censors. But the industry will probably figure out a way to skirt the regulations, says a scriptwriter. Show titles could be tweaked, for instance, to make them sound more grounded, and plots could be toned down. The demand for schlockier fare does not seem to be diminishing. Some Chinese on Weibo, a social media platform, have criticized the new rules. "Life is hard enough already," said one. "Do you want me to watch miserable TV dramas too?"
China.
China and America, Part 2. Intruder alert. Chinese hackers are deep inside America's telecoms networks.
News of the hack began trickling out in September, but the American government waited weeks to confirm the reports. Only this month did it begin briefing members of Congress and the media. Officials say a Chinese hacking group dubbed Salt Typhoon compromised at least 8 of America's telecoms networks. The intruders stole the call record metadata of a large number of Americans. They gained access to the wiretap requests of security agencies, meaning they could work out if any Chinese spies or agents were under American surveillance. And they targeted phones used by officials and politicians, reportedly including Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, and members of the Biden administration and the Harris-Walz campaign. Mark Warner, the chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, has called it the worst telecom hack in our nation's history by far. After receiving a briefing from intelligence agencies, Brendan Carr, the incoming chair of the Federal Communications Commission, said, "It made me want to basically smash my phone." The hackers remain inside the networks. American officials are struggling to understand how deeply they have penetrated. The government does not know when it will be able to root them out. The work of Salt Typhoon is the latest demonstration of China's hacking capabilities. In 2023, American officials discovered that intruders from another Chinese group, Volt Typhoon, were lurking inside networks attached to America's critical infrastructure. Typhoons are a naming convention used by Microsoft, a tech giant, for China-affiliated hacking groups. Russian groups are called blizzards. Iranian groups are sandstorms. The Chinese weren't disrupting anything, just checking in every 6 months to ensure they still had access. They had been doing this for 5 years before the hack was discovered. The discovery of the Volt Typhoon intrusions was the first time American officials were able to find Chinese hackers preparing for conflict on our networks, says Brandon Wales, the former executive director of America's Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Since then, American officials have been sounding the alarm. China was called the most active and persistent cyber menace in this year's threat assessment by the American intelligence community. Christopher Wray, the outgoing FBI director, has said that even if every one of his cyber agents and intelligence analysts worked exclusively on China, they would still be outnumbered by China's hackers by at least 50-1. China's prowess at hacking is the result of more than a decade of investment by the government. The push under Xi Jinping, China's leader, was motivated by a sense of threat, says Dakota Carey of the Atlantic Council, a think tank. Mr. Xi came to power in 2012, shortly after China discovered and executed more than a dozen of the CIA's informants in the country. Then in 2013, Edward Snowden revealed that America had been hacking hundreds of targets in China. In response, Mr. Xi established a new agency and a Communist Party committee focused on cyber security. The state certified some Chinese universities as world-class cybersecurity schools, and China's top intelligence agency started sponsoring hacking competitions. A recent report by Chinese universities said that the country is producing 30,000 new cybersecurity experts each year. The Ministry of Public Security has also made it harder for Chinese experts to share with the public vulnerabilities they discover in commonly used tech. These are now reported to the government. China denies that it is behind the recent hacks in America. Officials in Washington aren't having it. On December 4th, security agencies in America issued a joint statement with those of Australia, Canada and New Zealand on how to strengthen telecoms networks against the Salt Typhoon hack. New defences are needed. China is just beginning to reap the benefits of its decade-long investment in cyber activities, says Mr. Carey. We're just getting to the part where their hackers are really good. More typhoons are coming.
Culture.
The papacy. Cardinal sin. Conclave offers a perfect trinity: deception, death, and a little sex.
No sane man would want the papacy, a cardinal tells Cardinal Thomas Lawrence, Ralph Fiennes, at the start of Conclave, a new film. Perhaps that is why so many popes have been so mad. There was Pope Urban VI, who grumbled when a cardinal he had ordered to be tortured did not scream loudly enough, and Benedict IX, who not only committed rape, murder and bestiality, but who also rather naughtily sold the papacy. And who could forget Innocent VIII, who, despite that promising name, allegedly drank the blood of young boys. The trick of electing the universal shepherd is, then, to select the cardinal with the least sin. This can take time, as Cardinal Lawrence, in charge of the gathering to choose a new pope, called a conclave, discovers. The election in the film lasts for days. Still, it could be worse. In the 13th century, it took 2 years and 9 months. The cardinals were eventually both shut in and starved out, locked in their palazzo. They were rationed to 2 meals a day if they did not decide by the 3rd day, just bread, water and wine after the 7th. The starvation rations have gone. The locking in cum clave with a key remains. Each papal conclave becomes a locked room mystery of biblical proportions, less a whodunit than a whodunwhat. The magnificent new film with Edward Berger, a German director, makes the most of this. Like an ecclesiastical Agatha Christie, Cardinal Lawrence, a papal Miss Marple, investigates each cardinal's sin over the course of this 2-hour film. Naturally, this mystery begins with a corpse, the previous pope, and it offers a lineup of pleasingly sinister suspects, the cardinals who jostle to replace him. These include the smooth Canadian Cardinal Tremblay, John Lithgow, Cardinal Adeyemi, Lucien Msatmati, angling to be first African pope, and the liberal Cardinal Bellini, Stanley Tucci. The holiest of holy men would look like a villain in a scarlet cardinal skullcap and cassock. Mr. Tucci, better known for having served the other side in The Devil Wears Prada, looks even worse than that. The fun comes from watching as each is undone by his sins, which are, as you might expect, the cardinal ones: pride, wrath, envy, and lust. And as always with whodunits, the setting is glorious. Tradition usually demands a country house. Conclave must instead make do with gods. This is a departure, but it works. Since God has good decorators, conclaves were first held in the Sistine Chapel in 1492. It is beneath Michelangelo's Last Judgment that Cardinal Lawrence passes his. This is a visually sumptuous film, at times, like the chapel itself, almost too sumptuous. Minimalism was never Michelangelo's strong suit. In the 16th century, one priest sniffed that the sinewy naked bodies of the artist's frescoes were better suited to a tavern. This film too verges on the over-luscious. A scene in which flames curl around a papal ballot paper is almost perfume ad pretty. Silence saves it. Conclave is based on the book of the same name by Robert Harris, a British writer. Mr. Harris's books are commonly called thrillers, but they tend to eschew the commoner traits of that genre, most notably thrills. This one is no different. Almost nothing happens here, but it happens beautifully and understatedly. This film is swathed in silence. The Catholic Church has, for good and ill, always understood the power of silence, and so does Conclave. Like the liturgy, it wields it to build drama. When someone drops a tray, you jump. Mr. Fiennes is perfect for the role. His is a career that has also been steeped in quiet. In The English Patient, he smouldered silently. In The Dig, he dug silently. Here he doubts silently. Mr. Harris's book demands this taciturnity. Its epigraph comes from the writings of Paul VI, who became Pope in 1963. I was solitary before, he wrote, but now his solitude was complete and awesome. Like a statue on a plinth, that is how I live now. This, then, is also a film about the papacy, but it is also about humanity. Popes and cardinals are God's servants on earth. They are also, as Mr. Berger observed, just blokes going to work. When Cardinal Lawrence peers into the dead Pope's wardrobe, he finds papal robes in plastic suit covers. It is about being separated from humanity too. These are men who officiate and pontificate over the lives of 1.4 billion people. But they lead lives that are utterly alien. In their cardinals' uniforms, they look like superannuated schoolboys. They are buttressed by the Vatican's women. Here you see the nuns toiling, cooking, serving, tidying up the messes, physical and metaphorical, left by their brethren. One of the best scenes comes when Sister Agnes, Isabella Rossellini, squares up to Cardinal Lawrence. She loses, just. Even Ms. Rossellini's Mother Superior stare cannot overcome 2,000 years of ecclesiastical power. Nonetheless, this film about the world's most powerful patriarchy is a quietly feminist one. What are the sins of our fathers? Ask the mothers. They probably know.
Europe.
The French government falls. Thread by thread. Michel Barnier's downfall accelerates the unravelling of the French centre.
Emmanuel Macron, France's president, had barely landed from Saudi Arabia when he lost another prime minister, his third this year. In a no-confidence vote on December 4th, an unholy alliance of the left and Marine Le Pen's hard-right National Rally, or RN, brought down Michel Barnier, a conservative with whom Mr. Macron has shared power since September, by a total of 331 deputies, 43 more than was needed. The vote followed Mr. Barnier's use of a special provision to force his budget through Parliament. It marks the first time deputies have toppled a government since 1962. With Mr. Barnier, the budget falls too, plunging France into yet more political instability. Mr. Macron's great centrist project is unravelling fast. At the head of a minority coalition, Mr Barnier failed despite his best efforts to secure broader support. He had drawn up €60 billion, that's $63 billion of tax increases and budget cuts, designed to shrink the deficit from 6.1% of GDP this year to 5% next. In a final effort, Mr Barnier ceded ground to the RN and its friends, who hold 140 seats in the 577-seat lower house, to no avail. The country is going through a profound crisis, lamented Mr Barnier before the vote. Mr Macron seems to want to appoint a successor swiftly. A new team, or the old one, could use special measures to roll over this year's budget provisions without inflation adjustments into 2025. Various veteran centrists or conservatives could be stopgap options. Some centrists are pushing the president to name a figure from the moderate left in an attempt to split the left-wing alliance. Whoever takes over, however, the underlying problem remains: a deadlocked lower house split into 3 blocks and a chronic inability to forge cross-party compromise. Fresh legislative elections cannot be called until next July. It is all a long way from the great hope the Macronist centre once represented. When Americans first put Donald Trump into the White House, Mr Macron was transforming soggy centrism into a powerful pro-European, post-partisan platform. Twice he kept Ms Le Pen from the presidency. Borrowing ideas from left and right, Mr Macron built the centre into a force for consensus and stable government. Thread by thread, this achievement is unravelling. In 2022, Mr Macron lost his parliamentary majority. In July, at the snap election he rashly called, it shrivelled further. The shrinking centre represents both a political threat for France and Europe, and a personal drama for Mr Macron. The Constitution bars him from standing for a 3rd consecutive term in 2027. The courts may yet ban Ms Le Pen from standing for public office for 5 years, in a case over the misuse of public funds, to be judged in March. If not, though, she is the candidate French voters told one pollster they most want as their next president. On re-election in 2022, says an aide, Mr Macron told his team, "We've got to get to work because I don't want to hand the keys to Marine Le Pen." If the centre cannot sort itself out, his greatest worry could be his legacy. The unravelling or détricotage of Mr Macron's power at home has been abrupt. The president still runs defence and foreign affairs, but under Mr Barnier, domestic policy-making swung firmly to the Prime Minister. Shared advisers were scrapped. Several presidential aides quit. Mr Barnier's team was relieved to find that the president interfered less than we expected. For Mr Macron, whose appetite for detail extends to texting ministers at all hours, it was an enormous change, says an aide. Do you have any idea how he felt, having no say on the budget? It was a nightmare, says a former minister. Power sharing has had 2 other consequences. First, it reinforced Mr Macron's isolation. Defenders of his decision to dissolve Parliament became scarce. Would-be successors ever more outspoken. Edouard Philippe, who served as his first Prime Minister, accused the president of killing his previous parliamentary bloc. Gabriel Attal, an ex-Prime Minister, has taken over Renaissance, the party his mentor founded. In November, Mr Macron's popularity sank to 23%. Let's just say he's not living his best moment, says a centrist friend. Second, it rearmed Parliament, creating a triangular power relationship, notes Roland Lescure, a centrist deputy and ex-minister. The Prime Minister's ousting is the starkest evidence yet of Parliament's new clout, and Ms Le Pen the greatest beneficiary, although she may hesitate before trying it again. The RN leader is treading a fine line between a desire to acquire respectability and a need to flex her muscles to please her base. She doesn't want to be an architect of chaos, says an RN deputy. All this has spread a sense of dismay among Macronist centrists. Rival figures are nonetheless trying to work out how to protect the endangered centre, keep Ms Le Pen from office, and promote their own careers. At the very least, the centre needs to do three things: rally around a single post-Macron candidate, renew its stock of ideas, and find a way to speak to voters turned off by what they see as the arrogance of la Macronie. If it can't do this, comments one long-standing member of the tribe, the centre could die. On the first task, there is no shortage of aspirants. Besides Mr. Philippe, the 35-year-old Mr. Attal and Bruno Le Maire, a former finance minister, may fancy their chances. Broadening out, half a dozen other hopefuls lurk among moderate socialists and centre-right Republicans. If the centre does not watch out, overcrowding could hand a runoff place instead to the hard-left Jean-Luc Mélenchon. In shorter supply are ideas. Mr. Macron's central insight was that on big issues, Europe, climate change, technology, moderates from left and right are closer to each other than to their side's extremes. A post-partisan movement, he argued, could forge a different majority and unblock France. Once in office, however, Mr. Macron bequeathed less a party than a residual fan club, says an insider. Now in charge, Mr. Attal understands that he needs to build an army, not just operate a small commando, says a fellow deputy. But he inherits few activists or members. The party neither produces serious policy papers nor organises many conferences or debates. It is not too late to renew its software, argues Clément Beaune, a former minister and senior party figure. But individual ambitions and structural weakness will make collective work difficult. Mr. Trump's re-election underlines a third condition: the need to understand and respect those who vote for populists. The complex policy trade-offs that shape centrist politics do not lend themselves to simple messages. Nor, as Mr. Macron has learned, is it enough to create more jobs, lure investors, or keep inflation low if people do not feel you are fighting for them. Post-partisan centrism may survive. It remains 100% pertinent, argues Mr. Le Maire. The left-right divide is totally inefficient in dealing with the big challenges of our day. Or it could turn out to be a parenthesis, replaced by the party system it overthrew, or far worse. This week's drama is a sobering reminder of the centre's fragility and its eroding capacity to bring about the stability that France needs.
Europe.
Notre Dame. Resurrection. 5 years after the fire, the gloriously restored cathedral reopens.
If this monument is one day finished, wrote Robert de Torigny, a 12th century Norman monk of Notre Dame, no other will ever compare. The Gothic cathedral touches people, both the spiritual and the secular, in unusually powerful ways. It is a place of worship, a testament to human ingenuity, and a symbol of resilience. When, on April 15, 2019, flames engulfed its timbered roof and toppled its spire, the shock and sorrow were global. On December 7th, the Archbishop of Paris, Laurent Ulrich, will ceremonially reopen the rebuilt Notre Dame, Against the odds, France has stuck to the 5-year timetable set by President Emmanuel Macron. The result is breathtaking. Gone are centuries of dark and grime. Instead, the interior is luminous, the blanched stonework of vaults and pillars as it would have appeared in medieval times, the pigment of the restored 19th century chapel wall paintings bright. The restoration scrupulously respects the cathedral's original design and construction techniques. Sculptors and stonemasons worked with chisels and brushes to restore gargoyles and chimeras. Craftsmen used hand-forged axes to hew oak logs into square beams. Wooden dowel pegs hold the roof trusses together without metal pieces. The result is a showcase for French craftsmanship. The cathedral belongs to the French secular state, and a public body oversaw its rebuilding, yet it did so with almost no public contribution, thanks to nearly €900 million or $950 million raised from corporate and individual donations, many of them small sums from France and abroad. Traditionalists will doubtless bristle at the modern furnishings. Modernists will regret the lack of a bold contemporary architectural statement. Purists will say it has been over-restored. But the quality and craftsmanship are hard to fault. As Philippe Just, who runs the project, told The Economist earlier this year, we are restoring a cathedral that is 860 years old, so that it can last for at least another 860 years.
Business.
Omnicom and Interpublic. Ad agencies. A Madison Avenue mega-merger signals an industry in trouble.
Change is neither good nor bad. It simply is, declares Donald Draper, the unflappable star of Mad Men, a television drama set in 1960s Adland. Not all advertising executives share his sang-froid. Today, technology is changing the industry faster than at any time since Mr. Draper's era. The result is a reshaping of Madison Avenue that is leaving some ad men choking on their old fashions. The biggest example of the disruption so far is a deal announced on December 9th, in which Omnicom and Interpublic, the world's third and fourth largest ad agency, holding companies by revenue, proposed to combine to become by far the biggest. The deal, structured as a takeover of Interpublic by Omnicom, would bring together a client list including Apple, Disney, Johnson & Johnson and Mattel. In leapfrogging France's Publicis and Britain's WPP, the enlarged Omnicom would shift advertising's centre of gravity closer to New York. On the face of it, the industry's troubles are hard to grasp. True, the incoming Trump administration is worrying marketers with hints that it may curb pharmaceutical advertising, which contributes 6 to 8% of America ad revenue, or start a trade war that could hurt big-spending industries like cars and electronics. But advertising has never been bigger. Helped by a Summer Olympics and an American election, worldwide spending is on course to rise by 9.5% in 2024, crossing $1 trillion for the first time, reckons Group M, part of WPP. The trouble is that ever more of the business is slipping out of the well-manicured hands of the agency executives who used to control it. Tech companies led by Google, Meta and Amazon have made it easier for companies to create and buy their own ads. Those three firms, plus China's ByteDance and Alibaba, will rake in more than half of all ad spending this year. Group M predicts. Strip out the up-and-down period of the COVID-19 pandemic, and the global ad agency industry has grown by barely 3% a year since 2018, according to Moffett-Nathanson, a firm of analysts. Artificial intelligence, AI, threatens to erode their role further. Generative AI can write copy and draw images. On December 9th, OpenAI, maker of ChatGPT, released Sora, its video generator. AI is also making it easier to target consumers with the right ad. The technology could eliminate 7.5% of America's advertising jobs by 2030, predicts Forrester, a research firm. Moreover, AI tools are making it easier for clients to take advertising in-house or give the work to smaller agencies. The biggest 5 agency-holding companies had a 30% share of all agency services revenue last year, down from 37% a decade earlier, estimates Madison & Wall, an ad consultancy. Omnicom and Interpublic hope that together they will be protected against these trends. The company's bosses promise savings of $750 million per year by merging shared functions and say they will invest more in AI technology. Removing one competitor from advertising's top tier will improve their pricing power. Regulators may not like that, but as Omnicom's boss, John Wren, pointed out, the clout of Google and co. ought to reassure trustbusters that there will be no shortage of competition. Mr. Wren also expects a more business-friendly environment under Donald Trump. The tie-up has tremendous industrial logic, says Brian Weiser of Madison & Wall. Will it enable the agencies to compete with their tech rivals? That may be the wrong question. If I'm looking for state-of-the-art AI, am I going to go to my ad agency? Are you crazy? Asks Rishad Tobakawala, a former chief strategist at Publicis. AI will be a service that agencies plug into, like electricity, rather than a competitive differentiator, he argues. Perhaps more likely is that agencies push further into new kinds of work. The holy grail in the industry is combining ad buying with data analysis, argues Bernstein, a broker, which cites the successful acquisition by Publicis of Epsilon, a data company, in 2019. Publicis now has 25,000 engineers helping clients with everything from managing data to building apps. With this kind of work, agencies are competing more closely with consulting firms, which in turn are venturing into the ad content business, with offshoots such as Accenture Song. The bit of the advertising industry that seems most vulnerable is the creative part. The ability to charge for producing ads is going to decline significantly because of AI, says Mr. Tobakawala. The newly enlarged Omnicom will control an alphabet soup of creative agencies, including Omnicom's BBDO, DDB, and TBWA, plus Interpublic's McCann and FCB. This may be more than a single company needs, suspects Mr. Weiser. If the changes coming to Adland are going to be bad for anyone, it may be creative executives like Don Draper.
Leaders.
Russian sabotage. Flagship effort. Finland's seizure of a tanker shows how to fight Russian skullduggery.
Grey zone operations, hybrid warfare, slicing the salami. There are many terms for Russia's use of covert attacks that leave opponents unsure how to respond. The latest theatre seems to be the Baltic Sea. Twice in the past 2 months, commercial ships with Russian links have been accused of damaging cables by dragging their anchors. In November, after Telecom's cables to Scandinavia were cut, the Danish Navy detained the Yipeng 3, a Chinese freighter coming from a Russian port, for a month. But China refused to cooperate and the ship eventually sailed on. Then, on Christmas Day, an electric cable between Finland and Estonia was severed, allegedly by the Eagle S, a tanker shipping Russian oil under a Cook Islands flag. Finland took a stronger approach. Coastguards boarded the ship and took it to a Finnish harbour. A vast array of Russian spy gear was found on board. Finnish prosecutors are preparing criminal charges. Underwater infrastructure makes an attractive target for grey zone attacks, partly because much of it sits, literally, in a legal grey zone. Under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, or UNCLOS, countries have full jurisdiction only within 12 nautical miles, that's 22 kilometres, of their coasts. Many pipelines and cables lie in their exclusive economic zones, or EEZs, up to 200 nautical miles from the shore, where foreign ships engaged in innocent navigation have a right to free passage. Ships engaging in sabotage enjoy no such right, but proving that they are doing so usually means stopping the ship, a chicken and egg problem. Under the treaty, the country responsible outside territorial waters is the flag state, here the Cook Islands. That is a loophole, but UNCLOS's authors never imagined such problems. Indeed, damage to underwater cables is regulated by a different treaty dating from 1884. Underwater gear is also hard to protect. Cables in the Baltic can be hundreds of kilometres long. Many have underwater sensors to detect damage, but navies must be quick to find the perpetrator. NATO has ample naval resources in the area. Every Baltic country, save Russia, is a member, but these have been deployed mainly against traditional military threats, not to protect civilian infrastructure. And Russia has a secret weapon. Its dark fleet of tankers and freighters developed to evade Western sanctions after it invaded Ukraine in 2022. These are often poorly maintained, badly insured, and owned officially by front companies in Caribbean or Gulf countries. Besides threatening cables, they also menace the environment with potential oil spills. How to counter the threat? First, follow the Finns' lead. Their Coast Guard arrived so quickly that it seems to have caught the Eagle S red-handed, as the ship's crew hurriedly retracted its anchor chain. By impounding the tanker, the Finns have imposed significant costs on its owners. And bringing criminal charges under Finnish law against the owners, a company in the United Arab Emirates, for deliberately damaging infrastructure and investigating suspected crew members, creates a deterrent to further sabotage. Meanwhile, NATO has announced that it is beefing up its patrols in the Baltic. Next, cast the net wider. European countries should press the likes of China and the UAE to ensure that ships under their flags do not engage in sabotage, if they want their companies to be considered for lucrative contracts on European maritime infrastructure. Coast Guard should detain underinsured ships to help hunt down Russia's dark fleet. A growing hybrid threat requires a robust hybrid response.
Business.
Business in China. Prosperity uncommon. The China dream is fading for Western companies.
Things have never looked rosier for foreign firms in China, at least according to the country's Council for the Promotion of International Trade. The body, which is controlled by the Commerce Ministry, claims that 90% of foreign companies rate their experience in China as satisfactory or better. According to a recent survey by the Council, foreign firms say the economy is strong, local markets are attractive, and their outlook is bright. Following years of isolation during the COVID-19 pandemic, China's government insists that the country is open again for business and that reforms have made life easier for foreign companies. Executives of those companies scoff at all this. Many say they now struggle to justify investing in the country and talk instead of cutting staff. In a recent survey by the American Chamber of Commerce in Shanghai, less than half of respondents said they were optimistic about the prospects for their business in China over the next 5 years, a record low. On December 4th, General Motors, or GM, an American car maker, said it would write down the value of its once thriving joint ventures in the country and close some of its factories there. On December 9th, it was reported that China's government was opening a competition probe into Nvidia, America's AI chip champion. In recent decades, Western bosses looked to China not just as a place to make things cheaply, but as a vast and growing market for their wares. According to our analysis, the sales in China of listed American and European companies that disclose them peaked at $670 billion in 2021, accounting for 15% of those firms' total revenue. Things have gone south since. Last year, sales were down to $650 billion. Their share of total revenue slipped to 14%. This year has shown no sign of improvement. Of those firms in our dataset that report quarterly sales in China, almost half saw these decline year on year in the most recent reporting period. Companies confronting shrinking sales in the country range from Apple, a tech giant, and Volkswagen, a car maker, to Starbucks, a coffee chain, and LVMH, a luxury conglomerate. At this point, we should have turned a corner, complains the regional boss of a global firm. Another foreign executive laments that the days of feverish growth in China for his business have passed. Although some Western companies, such as Eli Lilly, a drug maker, and Walmart, a retail behemoth, continue to grow in the country, their ranks are steadily thinning. One reason for this is China's economic stagnation. A housing crisis has sent property prices across the country plummeting and caused consumers to tighten their belts. The central government signalled in September that it would do what it takes to reflate the economy. And on December the 9th, the Politburo announced that China would shift to a moderately loose monetary policy for the first time in over a decade. But expectations remain low. Property sales are still falling compared with last year and will probably continue doing so well into 2025. Despite the government's promises to stimulate consumption, gauges of demand are down. Deflationary pressure is hurting all companies in China, not just foreign ones, notes Bo Jungyuan of Plenum, a consultancy in Beijing. Fully 27% of Chinese industrial firms were making losses at the end of October. Oversupply in various industries, from electric vehicles or EVs to building materials, has led to ferocious price wars. Mary Barra, GM's boss, has blamed a race to the bottom for the firm's difficulties making money in the country. Yet Western companies are also being outcompeted by Chinese rivals. Starbucks has ceded market share to Luckin Coffee, a cheaper local competitor that in September had 21,000 stores in the country, about 3 times as many as the American chain, and up from 13,000 a year before. Brian Niccol, the newish boss of Starbucks, told investors in October that it faces extreme competition in China. It is said to be considering selling a stake in its business there to a local partner. In many industries, Western firms no longer enjoy the technological edge they once did over Chinese rivals. Chinese manufacturers of industrial robots now supply almost half the local market, up from less than a third in 2020. Apple's troubles in the country have been compounded by flashy new smartphones from Huawei, including the Mate 70 range it unveiled on November 26th. The EVs produced by BYD, NIO and other Chinese car makers are not only much cheaper than Western ones, but packed full of the clever tech that local consumers desire. When the Chinese market was still expanding briskly, Western firms were able to increase their sales there even as they lost share. They no longer have that luxury. If all that were not bad enough, Western companies are also becoming collateral damage in the rivalry between their governments and China's. On December 2nd, America introduced new restrictions on the sale of chip-making tools to certain Chinese companies, as well as of high-bandwidth memory chips. That will hurt American manufacturers of semiconductor equipment such as Applied Materials, Lam Research and KLA, as well as ASML, a Dutch maker of advanced lithography tools. Other Western chip businesses may also suffer as a result. After the announcement, 4 Chinese industry associations responded with a call to reduce purchases of American chips. The timing of China's NVIDIA probe suggests it too may be an act of retaliation for America's restrictions. Companies in sensitive industries such as chip making are familiar with the risk attached to their sales in China. The list of firms exposed to geopolitical ructions, however, is lengthening. The shares of European brandy makers, including Rémy Cointreau and Pernod Ricard, slumped in October after China said it would impose anti-dumping measures on the spirit, seemingly in retaliation for tariffs levied on Chinese EVs by the EU. Last month, the founder of Uniqlo, a Japanese clothing retailer, incurred the wrath of Chinese netizens when he said that the company did not use cotton from Xinjiang, a region of China mired in allegations of forced labour. China's Commerce Ministry may soon slap restrictions on the local operators of PVH, the American owner of Tommy Hilfiger and Calvin Klein, for complying with an American law that bans the use of cotton from the region. If Donald Trump follows through with his threat to raise tariffs on Chinese goods, Xi Jinping may respond by making life harder for American companies. Foreign firms in China are trapped in the middle of a dangerous geopolitical struggle, writes Andrew Polk of Trivium China, another consultancy. Their troubles will not ease soon.
Leaders.
Planetary change. Of clouds and Crutzen. Cleaning up pollution adds to global warming. Another reason to think about geoengineering.
Seen from afar, as it first was by human eyes on Christmas Eve 1968, Earth is a wonder. When the astronauts of Apollo 8 saw their bright cloud-girdled home rise over the barren lunar horizon, they recognized at once that it was dynamic, beautiful, and exceptional, something to be cared for. But the view from space does not only inspire, it also informs. Satellites reveal how Earth is changing, and thus what sort of care it needs. And the latest such diagnostic information is that although Earth remains as beautiful as ever, it has been getting a little less bright. Satellite data show that since the turn of the century, Earth's albedo, the amount of incoming sunlight it reflects, has been dropping. Because light not reflected is absorbed, that adds heat to the system and exacerbates global warming. It is part of the reason why the rate at which the planet is warming, until the 2010s around 0.18 degrees Celsius a decade, now appears to be well over 0.2 degrees Celsius a decade. In the decade to 2023, admittedly a particularly hot year, it was 0.26 degrees Celsius. For ecosystems under stress, the rate of warming can matter a lot. For humans, faster warming brings forward extremes that might not have been seen for decades. One reason for this dimming is air pollution, or rather its absence. Fossil fuels contain traces of sulfur, along with the carbon and hydrogen that give them their name. The sulfur dioxide that is created when hydrocarbons burn forms tiny airborne particles that makes the air smoggy. This is deadly. Every year global deaths from air pollution number in the millions. Preventing sulfur emissions from getting into lungs improves people's health, productivity, and spirits. This is why the Chinese Communist Party has been keen on such reductions, and China's efforts have been impressive. Over the past 2 decades, scrubbing sulfur from smokestacks has reduced its gargantuan emissions by about 90%. Likewise, restrictions on the sulfur content of fuel used by shipping has seen emissions on the high seas plummet since 2020. Reducing sulfur emissions also lowers albedo. Sulfate particles scatter light. As a result, some of it bounces back into space. Sulfate particles can also serve as seeds for the water droplets that make up clouds. Fewer such seeds can make clouds less bright. Sometimes clouds do not form at all. Quite how much of Earth's accelerated warming can be put down to the reduction in sulfur emissions is uncertain. The workings of clouds are complex, and sulfur is not the only factor at play. But atmospheric scientists have long expected more warming when this offset is removed. As one of the greatest of them, Paul Crutzen wrote in 2006, air pollution regulations in combination with continued growing emissions of CO2 may bring the world closer than is realized to the danger of catastrophic global warming. In his seminal paper, Crutzen also noted that there was an alternative. Particles high in the stratosphere stay aloft far longer than those close to the surface, and so provide much more cooling per ton. A thin layer of sulfates deliberately added to the stratosphere could provide the same amount of cooling as all the thick polluting smogs clogging the lower atmosphere while doing much less damage to human health. Crutzen did not advocate this, but he did say it should be researched more vigorously and that there might be deteriorations which warrant action. One such, he suggested, would be seeing the rate of warming rise above 0.2 degrees Celsius a decade. Since then, the amount of research into solar geoengineering with stratospheric aerosols has increased substantially, but it remains pitifully small, in part because the experts whom governments listen to on climate and research policy are leery of it. A report to the European Commission at the end of 2024 added to calls for a moratorium on practical steps towards it, and argued for various restrictions on research. And it is indeed a daunting prospect, not least because it requires a high level of trust in science, a resource declining even faster than the world is warming. Crutzen wanted swift cuts in greenhouse gas emissions to render debates about geoengineering moot. He also feared that this was just a pious wish. The world's capacity to do without fossil fuels has increased a lot since then, but emissions have yet to decline, and warming is speeding up. As well as cutting emissions, governments should urgently heed Crutzen's call for research and discuss how such powers might be used. The message of Apollo 8 still applies. The bright, beautiful world needs to be cared for.
Finance and economics.
Tariff retribution. With a vengeance. How China plans to fight back against Donald Trump.
Who is Hua的鲁特尼克? Howard Lutnick, the billionaire nominee to lead America's Commerce Department, is not well known in China, but he may end up shaping American trade policy. Since Donald Trump announced his pick, Chinese investors have scrambled for information. More than anything, they want to know if Mr. Lutenika will slap Mr. Trump's proposed 60% tariffs on all Chinese imports. Such efforts have only gained urgency in the past fortnight. The president-elect has threatened an additional tariff on Chinese goods on his first day in office, while the sitting president has ratcheted up export controls. Other nominees are better understood. Marco Rubio, presumptive Secretary of State, has tried to force Chinese firms to delist from American stock exchanges and was hit by sanctions in response to ones he helped put on Chinese officials as a senator. Mike Waltz, Mr. Trump's choice for National Security Advisor, boycotted the Beijing Winter Olympics. Jameson Greer, the new trade representative, was an architect of Mr. Trump's first trade war with China. In the face of such hawkishness, Chinese officials have kept quiet, but their formula for trade talks is starting to emerge. Xi Jinping, China's leader, laid down red lines in a recent meeting with President Joe Biden. The gist was that Communist Party rule and China's claim on Taiwan should not become bargaining chips. Then, on December 1st, Chinese tax rebates on aluminium and copper came to an end. Ones for batteries and photovoltaic products fell from 13% to 9%. This is a big shift. Over the past year, China has rejected claims it is exporting batteries and solar products at artificially low prices. As Martin Lynch Rasmussen of Exante Data, a research firm, notes, Cuts to rebates are the first time officials seem to have sought to lessen the force of such accusations. At the same time, Chinese officials want to increase trade with the rest of the world. The Ministry of Commerce has said that it will boost export credit and insurance and support logistics services. The ministry wants to expand the number of countries that can get short-term business visas, and it has promised to help companies respond to unreasonable foreign trade restrictions as they arise. The Biden administration recently announced tariffs on solar panels from several Southeast Asian countries, with the aim of stopping Chinese firms from rerouting exports through third countries. Mr. Trump may expand these as firms look for loopholes. Many have, for example, set up factories in Indonesia and Laos, two countries that are not covered by the latest policies. To help small businesses sell goods overseas via e-commerce platforms, Chinese local governments have established service centers. Shanghai is setting up a Silk Road e-commerce pilot zone to boost trade with Central Asia. Such tariff workarounds mean that America's existing measures have not stopped China from increasing exports. Since the start of Mr. Trump's trade war in 2018, China's trade surplus has more than doubled to $820 billion, or 6% of GDP. Its surplus with America remains at $340 billion, about the same as in 2018. If Mr. Trump is willing to strike a deal involving limited increases in tariffs, his measures might reduce annual Chinese GDP growth by just 0.4 percentage points between 2027 and 2029, according to Oxford Economics, a research firm. CF40 Research, a think tank in Beijing, estimates that moderate tariffs of 10 to 20% would slow China's year-on-year export growth to 1.5% next year, down from 2.2% if no tariffs were imposed. Mr. Trump's promised 60% tariff rise could shrink exports by 6.5% next year, which would have a devastating effect. What about retaliation? In the first phase of the trade war, China responded to tariffs by hitting American imports with similar penalties. The strategy was ineffective as America is less reliant on Chinese demand than the other way around. Some expect China to allow its currency to devalue against the dollar. Although doing so would make its goods cheaper, big drops in the yuan risk spurring capital flight. Instead, Chinese trade experts hope the government will focus on domestic policies to counteract American pressure. Lian Ping, an influential economist, has advised that it seeks to boost wages and consumer demand in order to steel itself against American economic attacks, which might be part of the plan. Ministers have promised stimulus to improve glum consumer sentiment. Bankers in Shanghai quipped that they were cheering on a Trump victory in hope of extra government spending. There is more to the president-elect's China policy than tariffs. America and China are still in the midst of a tech war that was started by Mr. Trump, amplified by Mr. Biden, and shows no sign of stopping. Mr. Biden has attempted to cut off China from inputs needed for advanced tech, such as AI chips. At the start of the month, hundreds of Chinese firms were added to the Department of Commerce's entities list, restricting American dealings with them. In October, the Treasury enacted a broad investment control regime that will stop most American investments in Chinese AI, semiconductors, and quantum computing. The Biden administration is also thought to be drafting a definition of which types of AI chips firms can sell to China. Mr. Trump could tighten it. Chinese firms may also soon be hit with sanctions from the Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC, which, unlike the Department of Commerce's entities list, restricts the ability to use dollars. The imposition of OFAC sanctions on a Chinese bank would lead to a freeze in dollar transactions with other banks, and probably to its collapse. These have so far been used sparingly, but the nominations of Messrs. Rubio and Waltz suggest that such measures could become more common, says a former American trade official. China's ability to dodge attacks is limited. Officials have pushed tens of billions of dollars into the semiconductor industry in an attempt to make China self-sufficient. Although this has shown progress, especially in chip-making machines, the country still does not make the most powerful chips, and sources less than 15% of its chips domestically. China is also reliant on the dollar-based financial system. Yuan transactions have risen in the past 2 years, but most still use SWIFT, a messaging network susceptible to American influence. Mr. Xi is already showing willingness to hit back. On December 3rd, a day after the Biden administration issued new chip restrictions, China barred exports to America of minerals needed for high-tech gear and weapons, including gallium and germanium. Chinese regulators may identify other items they can stop exporting without rocking domestic industries. Some antibody precursors, which pharmaceutical firms use, come exclusively from China and could make good candidates. Individual companies may find themselves part of the conflict. Last month, China employed a new tool, the Anti-Foreign Sanctions Law, to cut off Skydio, America's largest drone maker, from Chinese batteries. The law could be used to deny dozens of American firms Chinese-made components. American companies in China could also be hit. In October, an industry body called for a probe into Intel, an American tech firm, because of alleged security vulnerabilities in its chips. China's Commerce Ministry recently used its unreliable entities list to probe PVH, the American owner of brands such as Tommy Hilfiger, because it has complied with America's Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, which requires companies to refrain from using cotton grown in Xinjiang. The original bill was sponsored by Mr. Rubio. With him as Secretary of State, it is easy to see the potential for many more clashes and possibly even a total disregard for China's red lines. Mr. Xi is prepared to talk trade with Mr. Trump. Anything beyond that risks very quickly spiraling out of control.
Leaders.
Doing good. How to give. Let a balance of moral priorities, liberty and efficiency be your guide.
It is the season for giving. Nearly 2/5 of Americans tell pollsters that they sign over more of their savings to charity in the holiday season than at any other time of year. More than 2/3 of Britons say they plan to donate money at Christmas. But the labyrinth of charities, good causes, and people in need can be as hard to navigate as the seasonal family get-together. How to give well. Unfortunately, the idea that you should treat charitable donations methodically has been tarnished by effective altruism, a movement associated with Sam Bankman-Fried, or SBF, a convicted crypto conman who insinuated that his fraudulent enterprise was ultimately all about doing good. Happily, the notion that there is a wise way to give has a long and noble history. Aristotle suggested that virtue stemmed from correct giving to the right people, in the right amounts, for the right reasons, and at the right times. For the modern giver, 3 considerations could usefully serve as a guide. First should be to observe your own moral priorities. Giving to rescue dying languages and to save dying children both have an intrinsic value. Religion and philosophy may help you balance their competing claims. But ultimately, how important you find one good cause compared with another is a matter of personal choice. Another consideration is how much freedom you should allow worthy recipients to choose between different good things for themselves. You might be fired up with the mission to lift up the neediest out of poverty, but they may prefer to spend your precious money on a funeral for a close friend than to invest in a cow as a source of future income. You need to decide how much to defer to their wishes. This way of thinking helps explain why schemes offering cash transfers have become more popular in recent years. Give Directly, which offers such handouts in poor countries, has alone raised over $500 million in the past 3 years. The third consideration is efficiency. Be it preventing river blindness, improving literacy, or doling out cash, some organizations are better than others at getting the job done. However, it is not always possible to know how efficient charities are. Sometimes the dollar gains for each dollar spent are hard to measure, if not impossible. How do you quantify whether a program to support democracy has been successful? If an autocrat ends up in power, you may conclude the effort was futile. Then again, you may think it was worth staving off democratic collapse, at least for a while. Smaller charities can struggle to collect the data they need to evaluate their work. That does not mean charities that try to solve complex problems or lack data are worse, just that how well they do good is anyone's guess. When you can get evidence about charities' efficiency, it should enter your calculations. A defined goal, such as digging wells for clean water, should be measurable. So, too, should programs that promise quick results. Because some charities really do get more done per dollar, whom you give to can matter as much as how much you give. GiveWell, a charity ranker, spends thousands of hours on such calculations to produce a list of the best charities. Drawing on the SPF-free insights behind effective altruism, it focuses on the organizations with plenty of data and places special weight on saving the lives of young children. Charities themselves could do more to be transparent on efficiency so as to help donors make more informed decisions. Obviously, there is more than one way of measuring efficiency, and different methodologies will reflect different priorities. Rigorous giving calls for thought and judgment. That may seem like hard work, but the effort helps donors maximize the benefit of what is given. And as Aristotle argued, it makes those who give better, too.
Leaders.
Georgia. Keep it on your mind. The protesters and the president need support.
Georgia was once seen as a vital island of democracy in the Caucasus. A year ago, the European Union still hoped to fasten it to the West, formally recognizing it in December 2023 as a candidate for full membership. Since then, almost everything has gone wrong. First, in May, the ruling Georgian Dream Party passed a law requiring organizations that received money from abroad to register as foreign agents, a trick used in Russia and in Hungary under the autocratic Viktor Orban to harass pro-democracy outfits. Georgian Dream is led by a reclusive billionaire oligarch Bidzina Ivanishvili, who made a fortune in Moscow in the 1990s before returning home. He has tried to position his country in equipoise between Russia and the West, but has found himself ever more firmly under Vladimir Putin's thumb. The EU said in May that the new law looked as if Georgia were wriggling out of its pre-membership promises to reform, not least because the new conditions would hamstring independent election monitors. And the general election in October was indeed far from fair. Plausible claims of ballot rigging, biased state media, threats to ban opposition parties, and the intimidation of voters were well enough documented for the European Parliament to reject the result and call for a fresh poll. Georgia's president, Salome Zurabichvili, also called the election illegitimate. Georgian Dream responded on November 28th by suspending the country's accession talks with the EU, triggering vast demonstrations in the capital, Tbilisi, and many other cities besides. The police have responded with beatings and arrests. Amnesty International says it has verified numerous instances of torture and other ill treatment, several of which also revealed the organized and systemic nature of these abuses. As the protests and thuggery persist, a crisis looms. Georgia's next president must be chosen by an electoral college consisting of the parliament plus regional representatives. Ms. Zurabichvili, whose term is due to end on December 29th, says that this parliament is illegal and refuses to stand down until it is replaced by a body that was elected fairly. Meanwhile, the college, dominated by Georgian Dream, has chosen a new president, a former Manchester City footballer, in a vote with only a single candidate. How should the West respond? Ms. Zurabichvili needs support for her brave refusal to hand her office to Russia's choice. Those who back democracy should continue to recognize her, not her rival, as president. In addition, sanctions should be imposed on those responsible for the violence and for cooking the election. Some countries, including America, Ukraine, and the Baltic states, have made a start with travel bans on a few top officials and, in some cases, on Mr. Ivanishvili, who holds no government position. These could be reinforced by reaching further down the power structure to cover those who run the state media, say, as well as extending them to the subjects' families. Those most responsible should have their assets frozen. Two big omissions from the list of those imposing personal sanctions stand out. One is Britain. Like many other countries, it has halted most forms of official cooperation, but that hits mainly the innocent. The other is the EU. This week, its impressive new Foreign Affairs chief, Kaja Kallas, proposed a list of people for sanctions, but her move was blocked by the vetoes of Hungary and Slovakia, both led by apologists for Mr. Putin. If you needed an emblem of the EU's shameful weakness in the face of autocracy, that would be hard to beat.
Leaders.
The World Bank. Abandonment anxiety. Multilateral institutions are turning away from the poorest countries.
For 75 years, the World Bank has been one of the developing world's main sources of cheap finance. Its aid arm, the International Development Association, or IDA, distributes roughly $30 billion a year to 78 of the poorest countries. On December 6th, the fund was topped up by $100 billion for 3 years, an amount touted by A.J. Banga, the bank's president, as its biggest ever replenishment. But the fanfare disguises a sad truth. The world's multilateral institutions are turning away from its poorest countries. Mr. Banga's announcement left out some important details. Because most donor countries are tightening their belts, and the few small increases in contributions have been eroded by a strong dollar, the bank will have to borrow the extra money on financial markets instead. Those borrowing costs will, however, eventually be passed on. The IDA provides help to countries that range from large middle-income states, such as Bangladesh and Kenya, to Niger, where half the population is in extreme poverty. It offers countries access to finance through a mix of cheap loans and grants, which do not need to be repaid. Because the bank itself is borrowing on the financial markets, and because it is encouraging a shift away from grants, the concessions that the poorest countries receive are becoming less generous. The IDA illustrates a troubling trend in international finance. The bank is seeking a bigger pot of money at a higher price in order to help countries combat debt distress as well as to fight climate change. That delights rich countries which want their aid dollars to help cut more emissions, but it will eventually hurt the neediest because the poorest cannot afford to borrow as much as they did. Similarly, in October, the IMF said it would reduce surcharges, the extra interest that is meant to discourage indebted middle-income countries from borrowing more from the fund. By itself, that would not be a problem, but the fund will partly make up for its lost revenue by charging low-income countries interest for the first time. Half of them will now have to pay interest on their loans. Places such as Bangladesh and Pakistan do indeed need more windmills, electric buses and solar panels, but the fashion for climate dollars will squeeze out the finance that is most effective at poverty alleviation. Cheap money from the IDA lets indebted governments make crucial investments without sliding into fiscal chaos. Although the bank worries that some of the poorest countries might spend its funds irresponsibly, research shows that for every increase in IDA loans equivalent to 1% of national income, a borrowing country's GDP per person rises by 0.35% after a year. Its most effective funding is grants to the poorest countries. the best way to speed up poverty alleviation would be to reduce the price of the World Bank's assistance, even if that means a smaller IDA overall. However, a reduction in concessions for the poorest countries means that borrowing will instead probably flow towards the richest eligible places, such as Bangladesh or Kenya. But whereas these can borrow on international markets, the poorest have few other options. The cost of external finance for low-income countries has quadrupled since 2012, and the poorest 40 are completely shut out of global markets. Niger relied on IDA loans worth more than 8% of GDP in 2023. Global bond investors will not give it the time of day. Rises in effective interest rates for the poorest countries of even a percentage point or two could prevent governments from building roads and hospitals and making other basic investments. Moreover, poor borrowers could be pushed further into the arms of China, something that Western countries say they want to avoid. China has already overtaken the World Bank as the most generous lender to the developing world. If global institutions are both to lend more for climate finance and to help the poorest countries develop, they must be more open about the trade-offs they face. That way, rich country shareholders will knowingly make choices about expanding their financial commitments and be expected to answer for what happens should they demur. For 3/4 of a century, the World Bank has been a lifeline for the world's poorest people. It should not desert them now.
Obituary.
Shalom Nagar, the Israeli prison guard who hanged Adolf Eichmann, died on November 26th, aged 88.
At midnight on May 31st, 1962, Shalom Nagar looked his prisoner in the eye. They stood perhaps a metre apart in a room on the second floor of Ramla prison in central Israel. Adolf Eichmann was tied at the wrists, knees and ankles and stood on a trapdoor, as instructed. He still wore his brown plaid slippers. A thick rope was knotted round his neck. He had refused a blindfold. Just before, he had smoked a cigarette and drunk half a cup of white wine. The smell of both was on his breath. Over the past 6 months, they had often been this close. This close while Eichmann, peering through his glasses, wrote his memoirs at a tiny desk piled high with books. This close when Eichmann dressed, buttoning his shirts to the neck and shuffling into the favourite slippers. This close while he washed, shaved, used the facilities, made his bed and paced around a tiny courtyard. This close while he ate from a plate of food into which Officer Nagar had already dipped a fork here and there. It was a curious intimacy to share meals that way. They came in locked containers so that Eichmann would not be poisoned. If Officer Nagar was not dead after 2 minutes, all was well. He was the innermost guard of the 22 who watched Eichmann, his 24-hour shifts always spent in his personal cell. An entire wing on the second floor, 5 rooms, had been given over to this man. Israel had never held so important a prisoner. Eichmann had been in charge of the whole logistics of the Holocaust, the roundings up, the deportations, the railway shipments, and ultimately the deaths of millions of Jews. After the war, he had escaped justice and fled to Argentina, living as a quiet suburbanite until Mossad tracked him down. In 1961, on trial in Jerusalem, he showed no remorse and accepted no blame. He had been following the orders and iron will of Hitler. He was a little cog in the machinery. The sight of him, thin, nervy-looking, balding, compulsively clean, might almost have convinced Officer Nagar this was so. Most of the guards at Ramla would happily have killed him. Almost all were Ashkenazi, either survivors of the camps or men who had lost family there. Officer Nagar, by contrast, was Sephardi. The long arms of Hitler and Eichmann had not reached Yemen, where he was born, though his father had once gone to scout out mountain hideaways in case they did. His childhood had been hard enough. From the age of 8, with his father dead and his mother unable to cope, he lived on the street in the Jewish part of Sana'a, running errands for food and sleeping at night under market stalls, wrapped in his father's goatskin prayer shawl. How he blessed that shawl. But unlike his Ashkenazi brothers in the force, he had no numbers tattooed on his arm or on his mind. That very fact, the authorities thought, made him the ideal man to hang Eichmann. It would not look like vengeance then. He disagreed and begged them to find someone else. Of course, he did not like the man, but there was civility between them. They exchanged very few words, but he was the one who, at a signal, would fetch what he wanted or escort him to the lavatory, after which Eichmann always said gracias, imagining that, like many Sephardis, he came from Spain. He could not hang him. At 26 he could not hang anyone, but his superiors, in the end, held a lottery, and he was picked. To brace him for that probability, he had been shown a film of Nazi atrocities. He had to agree that there could be no mercy for Eichmann or any of his kind. Besides, orders were orders. He was well imbued with that code. At 16, 4 years after migrating to the new state, he had joined the Israeli army, first in the parachute brigade and then in the border patrol. When ordered to jump, he jumped. If told to dismantle landmines, he went to it. When a police van screeched up beside him as he walked on his day off down the street with his family, and he realized that this was the time to hang Eichmann, he climbed in. And now, at midnight, he yanked the lever backwards without hesitation, and the trap door sprang open, hurtling Eichmann towards the basement. It was the first and last judicial execution performed in Israel. What he had to do next was far harder. He had to take down the body, wrap it in sheets, push it on a stretcher to the oven, already red-hot for it, and then transport the ashes to the sea where they would be cast out beyond Israeli waters. But he was traumatized by the sight of the body, the chalk-white face, the lolling tongue, the blood on neck and chest where the rope had torn the skin away. To take Eichmann down involved lifting his head, which drove trapped air out of his mouth in a booming cry, a cry as if the angel of death had come for his executioner too. He was not easily scared, but now, shaking all over, with Eichmann's blood on him, he could barely manipulate the stretcher or close the oven doors. His orders were moot now. He had to be taken home. Those moments gave him nightmares for years. He could not return to the second floor at Ramla unless 2 colleagues escorted him. He tried it once alone, singing a Yemeni song for courage, but mistook his own shadow on a glass door for Eichmann and tumbled down the stairs in terror. The hauntings stopped only as he recovered the faith of his childhood. He had been brought up strictly as far as religion went, wearing sidelocks and avoiding women. When he first came to Israel at 12, the easy ways of the kibbutzim scandalized him. Once in the army, he fell away from all that. After hanging Eichmann, it returned. He eventually spent his days in his local kollel, the rowdy hall of reading and arguing over the Talmud. Conquering his nerves, he also became a ritual slaughterer of chickens. And he came to understand that his quick, fatal action in 1962 was at the behest of God. On that day, he had performed a great mitzvah. He had obliterated the enemy of Israel, Amalek, erasing his memory from under the sky. Even, perhaps, from the stairs to the second floor.
Asia.
South Korea. A president on the brink. A failed attempt to impose martial law has set off a constitutional crisis.
Seoul's Spring, the highest-grossing South Korean film of 2023, tells the story of how Chun Do-hwan, a military dictator, seized power more than 40 years ago. It is supposed to be an edifying historical drama, a reminder of the horrors the country endured under martial law and of how far it has come in the decades since. Instead, on December 3rd, Yoon Suk-yeol, the current president, staged a real-life sequel by imposing martial law for the first time since Chun's era. The film has shot back to the top of streaming platforms in South Korea. Mr. Yoon, however, has crash-landed. After quickly backtracking on the declaration of martial law, he now faces imminent impeachment or even arrest. Mr. Yoon has been defiant since his failed self-coup. He survived an impeachment vote in the National Assembly on December 7th, thanks to a boycott by his People's Power Party, or PPP. The party then proposed an orderly transition of power. But the dubious legality of this arrangement caused a constitutional crisis. By law, Mr. Yoon remained in charge of the country and the commander-in-chief. In political and moral terms, he had lost all authority. The president underscored his unfitness for office with a raving address on December 12th, the 45th anniversary of Chun's coup. He accused the opposition of seeking to turn South Korea into a paradise for foreign spies and a drug den overrun by gangsters. He railed against a parliamentary dictatorship that thwarted his agenda and promised to fight until the end. The speech came shortly after Han Dong-hoon, the head of the PPP, had changed tack and called for immediate impeachment. The Democratic Party, or DP, the main opposition, will hold a vote on a second impeachment motion on December 14th. Only 8 PPP members need to break ranks for it to pass. Pressure from the streets is also building. Protest movements have been a powerful force in the country's history, from the democratization process in the late 1980s to the impeachment of a former president, Park Geun-hye, in 2016 to 17. Tens of thousands gathered on December 7th. Smaller rallies have since persisted. The mood is carnivalesque, with music, dancing and vendors selling lighting sticks intended for K-pop concerts that have been plastered with anti-Yoon slogans. But the protests are fuelled by real fury. "I'm too old to be doing this in the cold, but I'm just so angry," says Park Ju-yeon, a 62-year-old pensioner from Seoul who promises to continue until Mr. Yoon is gone. The picture of the fateful night of the coup has become only more disturbing as details have emerged. Troops were dispatched not only to the National Assembly, but also to the National Election Commission. Mr. Yoon says this was to gather evidence of purported North Korean hacking, which he implies led to his party's defeat in general elections in April. The president ordered the arrests of leading politicians, including Lee Jae-myung, the head of the DP, and even Mr. Han. As farcical as the affair now seems, the intent was all too serious. One Special Forces commander testified that Mr. Yoon personally called him during the operation and ordered him to break down the doors and drag out the lawmakers inside. Only a small cabal, many of whom graduated from the same high school as the president, knew of the plot in advance. Ri Chang-yong, the governor of the Bank of Korea, was among many senior officials who learned of the impending martial law only when he saw Mr. Yoon on television. The declaration was so unlikely that I initially thought the video was a deep fake and that the television station had been hacked, says Mr. Ri. In retrospect, signs of Mr. Yoon's intentions had been visible. In recent months, he had moved loyalists into key positions in the Defence Ministry and intelligence services. Opposition leaders have been warning of the possibility of martial law since August. Mr. Yoon's Defence Minister Kim Yong-hyun dismissed the idea as fear-mongering during his confirmation hearings. He ended up being the first official arrested in connection with the plot. He attempted suicide while in custody. Mr. Yoon's justification for his rash act is unlikely to convince many. Mr. Rhee calls the move an unnecessary and unimaginable mistake and an embarrassment. Other current and former officials, politicians and diplomats use even starker language. Shameful, stupid, crazy, surreal, unthinkable, outrageous, psychotic. The consequences will be far-reaching. Mr. Yoon positioned his country as a democratic bulwark, even co-hosting with America a summit for democracy in Seoul this year. He promoted the idea of South Korea as a global pivotal state. He has instead made it look ridiculous. American officials insist that their alliance with South Korea remains ironclad. Yet trust in it may suffer, especially since America had no advance notice, despite having nearly 30,000 troops stationed there. South Korea will also be in a worse position to manage Donald Trump, America's president-elect. A long-time skeptic of the alliance, Mr. Trump discussed withdrawing American troops from the Korean peninsula during his first term. South Korea's best hope of changing his views was for its leader to forge a personal bond, but there is likely to be a leadership vacuum in Seoul when he is inaugurated. The political crisis may well drag on for months. If the National Assembly approves a motion to impeach, the president will be suspended, with power passing to the Prime Minister in the interim. The Constitutional Court then must issue a final ruling within 180 days. The court has just 6 of its 9 seats filled. 3 justices retired in October. While only 6 votes are needed to convict, in normal circumstances 7 would be required for a quorum. It is a matter of debate whether the court could issue a verdict in its current state. Prosecutors may get to the president even sooner. South Korean law makes treason an exception to presidential immunity. The National Assembly voted on December 10th to empower a special counsel. Investigators have already put Mr. Yoon on a no-fly list and moved to search his office. Mr. Lee, the DP's presumptive presidential candidate, faces his own legal problems, having been convicted of lying to investigators. He calls the charges politically motivated. The PPP hopes that his conviction will be upheld on appeal before the next election, barring him from running. A second constitutional crisis looms as he tries to stand regardless. Any DP candidate will be favoured to win the new elections. If they do, foreign policy will be an area of dramatic change, reckons Kim Suk, a former ambassador. Those changes will probably frustrate Western governments that welcomed Mr. Yoon's alignment with America, Japan and Europe. The DP may bid for more engagement with North Korea, which has been happy to sit back and watch Mr. Yoon's antics. The relationship with Japan will face friction. DP leaders are also loath to aid Ukraine or Taiwan. The impact on South Korea's economy will probably be more muted. There is a mechanism for economic issues to be dealt with irrespective of political issues, says Mr. Rhee. Mr. Yoon's finance minister has agreed to take part in a consultative body for emergency economic policymaking alongside the DP. Daily life has continued without interruption since the abortive martial law attempt. Acute turbulence on financial markets proved short-lived, but prolonged political uncertainty will make it harder to tackle longer-term economic challenges. A DP president will want to implement labour-friendly policies, while corporate governance reforms that Mr. Yoon promoted may stall. For all the turmoil, the incident has also highlighted the evolution and resilience of South Korea's democracy. During Chun's rule, Ms. Park, the pensioner, and her husband, Hyung-bae, were too afraid to protest. Previous periods of upheaval, including the massacre of protesters by Chun's forces in Gwangju in 1980, helped strengthen South Koreans' dedication to democracy. I hope this will be another of those episodes that feeds into that process, says Mr. Park. The film version, when it inevitably gets made, will write itself.
International.
The Telegram. The Art of the Deal. Global Edition. Donald Trump will have vast leverage over American allies, but ruthless despots may resist his deal-making.
With the right portfolio of assets, property developers enjoy tremendous power over architects, builders, and potential tenants. Yet even the richest have little leverage over arsonists. That bricks-and-mortar framing is surprisingly helpful for understanding why America's next president is both right and wrong about his ability to reshape the global order. The Telegram is willing to risk a prediction. In his second presidency, Donald Trump will wield tremendous power over allies and countries that profit from ties with America. With adversaries ready to burn relations with the West to the ground, his grip will be less sure. Mr. Trump sounds confident that he has leverage on all fronts. Big economic partners, whether that means Canada, China, the European Union or Mexico, have been warned to brace for tariffs on their exports, followed by calls to renegotiate terms of trade with America. At the same time, Mr. Trump has pledged to end Russia's war with Ukraine within 24 hours. He has warned Hamas to release hostages taken in Israel on October 7, 2023, or face being hit harder than anybody has been hit in the long and storied history of the United States of America. The strengths and limits of this approach are apparent to American and foreign officials who watched Mr. Trump's first presidency up close. It is striking how often the same insiders draw lessons from his career building casinos, hotels and golf courses. Indeed, go back to interviews that Mr. Trump has given over many years, and he sometimes makes America's economy sound like the world's most valuable bit of real estate. Because he thinks previous American presidents were suckers, who let foreign partners pay too little for access to it, he is ready to impose aggressive rent reviews. In Mr. Trump's first presidency, numerous allies endured his deal-makers' scrutiny. This was often a humiliating experience. In June 2017, Panama's then-president, Juan Carlos Varela, secured a meeting in the Oval Office, a visit liable to boost him with voters back home. During their encounter, Mr. Trump questioned why American warships pay to use the Panama Canal, which returned to Panamanian control in 1999. Mr. Trump told his Panamanian guest that surrendering the canal zone was a terrible deal and that we should take that thing back, recalls America's then ambassador to Panama, John Feely. To his relief, the Panamanian leader, whom he had assiduously prepped to avoid confronting Mr. Trump at all costs, tactfully changed the subject, Mr. Feely says. Mr. Varela asked his host, "Mr. President, can I ask you a question? How are you doing in Syria?" "America is winning," he was told. Another former American official watched Mr. Trump bullying a string of allies and draws links to his business career. As a developer, Mr. Trump routinely told suppliers to lower their prices after they had completed projects. Some sued. Others wanted future business, so gave in. He always stiffed his subcontractors, notes that eyewitness. To him, allies are like subcontractors. Many times Mr. Trump's unconventional thinking cut to the quick of things, the former official goes on. Mr. Trump asks very good questions and was a wrecking ball to things that needed to be disrupted. He had a patchier record when it came to building sturdier alternatives. Too often his ambitions were thwarted by his impatience with detail and by his struggles to understand foreign leaders guided by incentives very different from his own. For all his tough talk, Mr. Trump wants to be loved, seeing himself as a man of destiny sent to protect ordinary Americans' interests, says the former official. He craves the approval of financial markets and of very rich people, whose wealth he takes as a proxy for brilliance. Truly cold-blooded rulers confound him. Someone who is utterly ruthless and who will slaughter anyone they need to, Trump can't get his head around that. In his first presidency, the businessman was totally shocked by intelligence briefings about Syria's then-dictator Bashar al-Assad using poison gas on women and children in his own country. In contrast, the same former official watched Mr. Trump failing to fathom leaders who acted on humanitarian impulses, as when Germany's then-Chancellor Angela Merkel told him she had allowed Syrian refugees into her country because it was the right thing to do. Those same blind spots could become apparent once more when Mr. Trump returns to office. President Vladimir Putin is willing to sacrifice terrible numbers of Russian lives to keep pushing deeper into Ukraine. Given that the Russian leader is currently winning ground while Ukraine suffers a crisis of manpower and morale, some Western officials wonder why Mr. Trump imagines he can force Russia to stop the war soon. Trumpian threats to strike Hamas are equally unconvincing, for that terrorist group is willing to see Gaza destroyed to advance its fanatical goals. A former Western diplomat says that Mr. Trump placed excessive faith in economic incentives, as when he left an Obama-era pact to constrain Iran's nuclear program, the JCPOA, in 2018. Trump aides told allies that their builder-boss saw the pact as an edifice with bad foundations, fit only for demolition. The JCPOA was imperfect, agrees the former diplomat. Still, it imposed real curbs on Iran, and Mr. Trump's rebuilding plan was worse. He asserted that harsher sanctions would swiftly bring Iran to its knees, leaving its rulers begging for a new deal. This did not happen. Nor was North Korea's hereditary despot Kim Jong-un swayed by Mr. Trump's invitation to abandon nuclear arms and develop his country's beaches for tourism. To the former diplomat, Mr. Trump is constrained twice over, by his vast lack of knowledge about abroad, and by his instinct that America should disengage from foreign wars. In a world on fire, the art of the deal has limits.
Business.
Right-wing tech bros. All in on Donald Trump. The PayPal mafia celebrates its takeover of America's government.
On the night of December 7th, San Francisco's Palace of Fine Arts, with its lakeside colonnade echoing a Roman ruin, turned into Mar-a-Lago. Silicon Valley's newly emboldened right-wingers had gathered for a Christmas bash organised by the All In podcast. The festive good cheer did not extend to everyone. The Economist was made to feel most unwelcome, but not before being privy to a riotous celebration of how a clique of billionaires, the so-called PayPal mafia, helped clinch Donald Trump's election victory and is taking Washington by storm. The four venture capitalists that host All In have a lot to feel smug about. In June, just two of them, David Sachs, a PayPal alumnus, and Kamat Palihapitiya, threw a fundraising event for Mr. Trump when he visited San Francisco, which raked in $12 million. On December 5th, Mr. Trump returned the favour by naming Mr. Sachs his artificial intelligence or AI and crypto czar. Mr. Sachs accordingly wore a Russian fur hat to the event. Alongside Mr. Trump, the All In podcast counts Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, two other PayPal mafiosi, as friends. From the stage, there was jubilation over Mr. Musk's influence on the president-elect. Being Elon Musk is a pretty fucking sweet deal, declared a video kicking off the event, and Mr. Thiel's patronage of J.D. Vance, the incoming vice president. The PayPal mafia's takeover of the government is now complete, so good work on that, quipped Aaron Levy, the founder of Box, a cloud storage firm, and a Democratic donor decidedly out of place. The event featured giddy excitement over cryptocurrencies and defence tech firms like Anduril and Palantir, but some of the loudest cheers, including a hallelujah from the stage, went to efforts to fix the budget deficit and rein in out-of-control government spending. The hosts also made clear who was out of favour. Sam Altman, the chief executive of OpenAI, maker of ChatGPT, was roundly mocked. He is Mr. Musk's nemesis. Mr. Palihapitiya, with the future AI czar at his side, described OpenAI as the biggest disappointment of this year and heaped praise instead on Mr. Musk's XAI. Women were underrepresented. One female entrepreneur walked out in disgust at the male energy. Top of the hate list was legacy media. When your correspondent sought a word with Jason Calacanis, a co-host dressed as a jovial Santa Claus on stage, he flew into a rage, shouting, "Don't talk to journalists." A few minutes later, he threw The Economist out.
Middle East and Africa.
Israel and Lebanon. A fragile ceasefire. As people return to their homes near the border, the truce remains shaky.
On the outskirts of Tyre in southern Lebanon, wailing mothers dressed in black gathered the bodies of their sons, which they had been unable to bury for weeks. In a village nearby, one man came home to find his dog had been shot dead. In another, a woman discovered piles of excrement in her bed. Others found that after months of Israeli bombings and ground operations by Israeli troops, they no longer had homes to go to. On the other side of the border in Israel, most people's homes were still standing, but thousands had been damaged by rockets fired by Hezbollah, the Iran-backed Shia militia that had dominated southern Lebanon. Israeli and Lebanese civilians who live near the border between the two countries have begun to return home after a ceasefire on November the 27th ended nearly 14 months of war between Israel and Hezbollah. Yet even as those who return survey the devastation, it remains far from clear that they will not have to leave again soon. Since October the 8th, 2023, when Hezbollah began firing rockets to support the bloody attack a day earlier on Israel by Hamas, more than 4,000 Lebanese and 127 Israelis have been killed in the conflict. Israel claims 3/4 of the Lebanese victims were members of Hezbollah. Lebanon says the toll includes nearly 800 women and more than 300 children. Some 70,000 Israelis and around 1.3 million Lebanese have been forced to flee their homes. In Lebanon, entire villages have been destroyed in the south. Scores of neighbourhoods have been levelled. Israel says it has targeted its attacks on Hezbollah headquarters and weapons stores hidden beneath civilian buildings. Over the next couple of months, Hezbollah is supposed to withdraw from all its positions in southern Lebanon as Israeli troops leave Lebanese territory, creating the conditions for repairing some of the damage, yet the truce is already shaky. Over the past week, both sides have committed numerous violations of the accord. On December the 2nd, Hezbollah fired 2 rockets at an Israeli position on a long-disputed section of the border. In response, the Israel Defense Forces, IDF, carried out airstrikes against what it claims were launchers and terrorist infrastructure. The IDF has also fired at Lebanese trying to return to their homes in the south, claiming that they were Hezbollah members in breach of the agreement. For now, both parties have an interest in sticking to the deal. Israel has achieved its objectives in Lebanon. It has killed most of Hezbollah's leadership, including Hassan Nasrallah, its veteran leader, and destroyed most of the group's guided missile arsenal, as well as its military infrastructure close to Israel's northern border. The ceasefire aims to ensure that Hezbollah will be kept well away from the border. Agreeing to the ceasefire was a bid by Hezbollah to hang on to what remains of its military power and political authority in Lebanon. The drubbing it has received in the past few months has not just battered the group, but has also eroded the regional standing of Iran, its main sponsor. That in turn has weakened Iran's main client, the regime of Bashar al-Assad in neighbouring Syria. Iran's worry that it is overstretched in the region may have spurred it to press Hezbollah to accept the ceasefire, even though Hezbollah used to maintain that it should depend on Israel stopping its war in Gaza. The deal may still collapse. It is based on UN Resolution 1701, which ended the previous war between Israel and Hezbollah in 2006 and mandated that Hezbollah withdraw its forces to the area north of the Litani River. Both the Lebanese army and the UN peacekeeping force in South Lebanon, known as UNIFIL, failed miserably to enforce Hezbollah's withdrawal at the time. The countries guaranteeing the latest ceasefire are not about to send troops of their own to enforce it, so it is unclear what will stop Hezbollah from re-establishing its presence in the south. European diplomats are scrambling to funnel cash and equipment to the Lebanese army to bolster it for the task. Though they acknowledge that the army chief, General Joseph Aoun, wants to enforce the ceasefire, many remain sceptical that his army is up to the task. Israeli officers suspect they may eventually have to return. They are banking on Hezbollah and its Iranian backers not wanting to provoke another round of fighting. For now, the Shia group may be content to lay low, though its ability to launch attacks has been diminished. It retains some of its hold over the Lebanese state. In Beirut's southern suburbs, some of its supporters hold a nighttime vigil at the site where Mr. Nasrallah was assassinated by a barrage of Israeli bunker buster bombs in late September. At his upcoming public funeral, the movement's surviving leaders are likely to proclaim victory for evicting the Israelis from Lebanon. However, many Lebanese, while glad to see the back of the IDF, have had enough of suffering the consequences of Hezbollah's wars, which have inflicted much more damage on Lebanon than on Israel. In Bint Jubail, a town in the south, some were grievously offended by a Hezbollah lawmaker's assertion that the 4,000 Lebanese deaths were a price worth paying. Yet some worry that the hit to Hezbollah's reputation caused by its hammering by Israel may leave the group with a point to prove. Says one Lebanese opposition politician, "What I fear now is that they will do something to reassert their authority. A show of force is what scares me."
Culture. Book review. The Russian Orthodox Church. Singing from Putin's hymn sheet. The Unholy Alliance of the Russian Orthodox Church and the Kremlin. The Baton and the Cross by Lucy Ash.
The invasion of Ukraine has provoked outrage and sympathy among Christian leaders of all denominations, including the Archbishop of Canterbury, the Ecumenical Patriarch in Istanbul, and the Pope. The Russian Orthodox Church is an outspoken exception. Patriarch Kirill, who leads the Church, has described the conflict as a holy war and said that any young man who died in action would be absolved of their sins. The war was essential to defending the unified spiritual space of Holy Russia, he claimed. In The Baton and the Cross, Lucy Ash, a journalist, offers an authoritative look at the closeness of church and state under Vladimir Putin. Russia is, in theory, a secular country, yet the Orthodox Church has become of vital importance to the president, as it gives credence to his ambitions. Putin found in the Church a spiritual outlet for long-held resentments, and an intellectual underpinning for his expansionist foreign policy, Miss Ash writes. Kirill, like his forebears, sought political patronage and access to wealth. The book places this unholy alliance in its historical context, tracing the Church's fortunes under Ivan the Terrible, Peter the Great and Catherine the Great, among others. In 1918, Vladimir Lenin stripped the Church of its legal status and right to own property. The number of working churches had tumbled from 50,000 before the revolution to a couple of hundred by 1939. It was Joseph Stalin who resurrected the Orthodox Church in 1943. He hoped that priests would galvanize public support for the Second World War from the pulpit, as they are doing today with Ukraine. The institution has maintained links to the state and its security services ever since. In the 20th century, some prelates, including even Patriarch Kirill, collaborated with the KGB. Others were fully-fledged agents planted in the church. A Soviet delegation to a gathering of the World Council of Churches in 1983 included no fewer than 47 KGB agents. Many priests have been more concerned with domestic politics than the heavenly kind. Their moral compasses point towards the Kremlin rather than Christ's teachings. In 2016, Vsevolod Chaplin, formerly a senior member in the church, spoke glowingly of both Ivan the Terrible and Stalin. What is wrong with destroying a certain number of internal enemies? Some people can and should be killed. Many Christians, not to mention the Bible, would tend to disagree. Patriarch Kirill has upheld his side of the devil's bargain, frequently preaching in support of Mr. Putin's culture wars, as well as his military ones. Mr. Putin urges Russian women to have 7 or 8 children. Meanwhile, the Church inveighs against abortion, gay rights, same-sex marriage, and even uppity wives. The Patriarch has contrasted Russia's holy and spiritual way of life with that of the devilish West, evident supposedly in its support of gay rights. Patriarch Kirill has said that nuclear weapons have saved the country, and in 2007, not long before he assumed the top role, blessed the nuclear arsenal. In return, Mr. Putin has in effect let Patriarch Kirill turn the Church into a money-making machine. Since the collapse of communism in 1991, the Orthodox Church has amassed a valuable property portfolio, thanks to the return of assets from the state, including land, which accelerated after Mr. Putin consolidated power. The Church has exploited its privileged status to develop huge business interests, with an annual turnover of millions and possibly even billions of pounds, Ms. Ash writes. Unsurprisingly, the Church's financial records have never been made public. For a man who has lambasted capitalism and the pursuit of profit, Patriarch Kirill appears to have personally profited from the arrangement. According to an investigation by Russian journalists cited in the book, he owns 3 properties and has been spotted sporting a watch worth tens of thousands of dollars. The irony is that, despite the Russian Church's revival in material terms, its spiritual authority is faltering today. Less than 5% of Russians regularly attend services of worship and prayer. Many Russians are angry at the Church's hypocrisy and see Patriarch Kirill's position not as one of power but of weakness. During a conversation in 2022, Pope Francis warned him that by parroting the president's talking points, he had debased himself to become Putin's altar boy.
Leaders.
Global business. Northern Lights. To see what European companies could become, look to the Nordics.
Nordic countries have long been considered exemplars of good public policy. Politicians around the world admire Denmark's social safety net, Finland's hospitals, Sweden's system of parental leave, and Norway's prisons. What gets less attention is that these countries also excel at nurturing world-beating businesses. They have only 0.3% of the world's population, and generate about 1% of global GDP, but produce plenty of corporate giants, from IKEA, the world's biggest furniture seller, to Lego, its largest toy maker, and Novo Nordisk, Europe's most valuable company. The rest of Europe could learn from them. Politicians in Brussels are perpetually searching for ways to invigorate the economy and nurture more corporate giants. The Nordics offer a tantalizing glimpse of what European business could be. Their corporate success is impressive. Our analysis shows that when compared with international rivals in the same sector, big Nordic firms tend to be much more profitable, while maintaining similar levels of revenue growth. They are also less indebted and invest more in research and development. Small wonder that over the past decade, firms from all 4 big Nordic countries have generated, on average, higher shareholder returns than those from European companies as a whole. One lesson from all this is to stay open. Nordic firms have thrived thanks to their international outlook. Company bosses in Denmark and Sweden proudly note how little of their total sales comes from their home markets. Among the 10 most valuable Nordic companies, the figure is just 2%, compared with 12% for big firms in the rest of Europe, and 46% for those in America. This is partly explained by small domestic markets, but it is also because of their openness to trade. Nordic companies tend to venture abroad when still young. International competition helps sharpen business models and perfect products. All the more reason for European politicians to make the case for ratifying an agreement struck in December with Mercosur, a big Latin American trade bloc. Another lesson lies in finance. For decades, the EU has been chasing a capital markets union, in the hope that deeper pools of money can boost business. The aim is reasonable, even if by itself plentiful capital does not ensure well-run businesses. Yet the experience of Denmark and Sweden, which have some of the deepest capital markets in Europe, shows that there is much that countries can do by themselves. Clever reforms in those countries have helped put household savings to work. Thanks to the pair's well-designed pension systems, they account for about a third of the EU's total pension assets, some of which are invested in local listed firms. In Sweden, investment savings accounts, which are easy to use and lightly taxed, have produced a booming retail investing scene. As a result, the country has become a hotspot for initial public offerings. In the past decade, it enjoyed more listings than France, Germany, Spain and the Netherlands combined. An openness to new technology matters too. Nordic businesses routinely top rankings of tech adoption in Europe, whether it is for enterprise software, cloud computing or artificial intelligence. Public investment in basic infrastructure such as 5G networks helps. So does a focus on digital literacy in education. Nordic governments themselves are highly digitized too, which cuts bureaucracy for businesses. For years, Denmark has come first in the UN's e-government index. Obtaining a value-added tax number there can take a day. In France, it can take months. The Nordic business landscape has its blemishes. Northvolt, a hyped Swedish battery maker, went bust because it stretched itself too thin. Nokia was once the king of mobile until it was usurped by the iPhone. And more companies may disappoint as life in Northern Europe starts to look less idyllic. Gang violence is a problem in Sweden. Across the region, far-right politicians are gaining ground. What is more, the world-spanning model of Nordic companies will have to grapple with the dismal new economic reality of rising trade barriers. Despite all this, the Nordics show that countries can balance a business-friendly environment with strong safety nets. Many politicians in Europe are fixated on trying to replicate the wonders of corporate America. But in some ways, they have a better model to emulate right on their doorstep.
Culture.
Book review. Artificial Intelligence. The Future of Humanity. Genesis by Henry Kissinger, Craig Mundy, and Eric Schmidt.
Henry Kissinger kept learning right to the end of his life. In the half-decade before he died in 2023, aged 100, he turned himself into an expert in artificial intelligence, or AI, adding to the fields of history, philosophy, Cold War diplomacy and nuclear deterrence that made him a master of 20th century realpolitik. Polymaths are rare, as he and his co-authors, Craig Mundy, formerly of Microsoft, and Eric Schmidt, who ran Google, point out in Genesis. Humans do not live long enough to master more than a few disciplines. But AI, they say, will be the ultimate polymath, pushing the boundaries of discovery from nanotechnology to outer space and unconstrained by human fears or biological limitations. The development of AI could be humanity's highest achievement. Yet it could end up replacing and subjugating its own inventors. This sense of the Promethean power of AI will be familiar to those who have read Kissinger's previous book on the topic, The Age of AI, published in 2021. Mr. Schmidt was a co-author. But Genesis is a posthumous postscript, written with more elegance and a darker sense of foreboding than its predecessor, and is as much about humans as about machines. AI, it suggests, is on the verge of a superhuman intelligence, which people will either control or be controlled by. Man's ability to coexist with it requires a common understanding of humanity that could be all the more elusive in a polarized world. The book argues that AI threatens some of mankind's strongest convictions. People believe in a pecking order: humans, then animals, and then machines. AI could vault machines to the top of the hierarchy. People identify by nations, but in the age of AI, sovereign-like power could accrue to the private firms that own and develop AI technology. Work helps shape human identity, but AI will recast the role of labour and the distribution of rewards. Wars will be fought between implacable foes who feel no pain. As a consolation, they may prefer to attack each other's data centres rather than people. People believe in the power of reason, but still do not understand how large language models reach their conclusions. Is this a dark enlightenment, bringing back an age of unexplained, quasi-religious authority? To assess the extent to which humans will keep hold of their destiny, the book grapples with a choice. Should mankind become more like AIs, it often refers to them in the plural, or should AIs become more like people? Its attempt to answer the first question is shallow and unconvincing. It talks of how humans will co-evolve with machines via brain-computer interfaces and other sci-fi-like forms of neural engineering in order to create superhumans. But it recoils at the clear risks. More interesting is the discussion of how people can infuse AI with a sense of human dignity and values. Though far from perfect models have been let loose on the world, people are learning how to make them safer. As well as ingesting global and local rules and regulations, AI models will learn doxa, or unwritten and overlapping human codes that broadly keep humanity stable. However, it gets trickier when one considers who should decide machines' sense of right and wrong, their ultimate safety catch. Some, it is worth remembering, question Kissinger's conscience. Genesis asserts that forging consensus on what human values are and how to invoke them to prevent the most extreme perils of AI is the philosophical, diplomatic, and legal task of the century. Kissinger's last foreign trip was to China at the invitation of President Xi Jinping to discuss the many risks humanity faced from AI. From beyond the grave, Kissinger is pointing in the right direction. But it is hard to think of anyone of his statesman-like stature who will spearhead the necessary world and generation-spanning conversations in the next few years.
Leaders.
Economic growth. Spanish lessons. Spain shows that there is nothing inevitable about Europe's decline.
A dozen years ago, Spain was a byword for economic failure. The country's government and banks appeared to be locked in a death spiral and depended on bailouts. Young people were leaving the country or protesting at their lack of opportunities. Homes lay half-built and airports abandoned, relics of a burst construction bubble. How that has changed. By our reckoning, the country is on course to be the best-performing rich world economy of 2024 across a range of measures, including GDP growth, inflation, unemployment, fiscal policy, and the performance of the stock market. Both overall economic growth and the pace of job creation are running faster than in America, which has been the envy of the rich world. Greece and Ireland, which were also crisis-stricken a decade ago, have fared well in 2024 too. So has Denmark, where the economy has been boosted by the success of Novo Nordisk's anti-obesity drugs. But it is Spain that offers the best rejoinder to those who say Europe is doomed to stagnation. Its economy is reaping the reward of past reforms. That offers lessons for the rest of the continent, but should also serve as a warning for Spanish policymakers today. One lesson is to focus on services and not fetishize manufacturing. Although industrial production has not fallen as fast in Spain as in Germany, partly thanks to lower energy costs, it has still stagnated. But tourism has bounced back from its pandemic low, and the country is moving up the value chain, increasingly exporting consulting services and technology know-how, as well as sun and sangria. Non-tourism services have risen from around 5.5% of GDP before the pandemic to 7 to 8% now, says BBVA, a bank. Another lesson is to stay open. Whereas young people once left Spain in search of opportunities, now they arrive instead. Since 2019, the country's foreign-born workforce has risen by around 1.2 million, mostly from Latin America. Many of these migrants are in low-paid, low-skilled employment, meaning that though the economy is 7% bigger than in 2019, it is only 3% bigger after adjusting for population growth. Yet that is still better than in countries such as Britain and Canada, which have seen similar immigration booms, but a decline in GDP per person. Spain has also welcomed investment from Chinese firms. On December 10th, Stellantis, a car maker, and CATL, a Chinese battery maker, said they would build a new battery factory in Zaragoza. Stellantis' biggest shareholder, Exor, part-owns the Economist's parent company. Chery International, a Chinese car maker, has chosen Barcelona as the site for its first European manufacturing plant. Most important, Spain shows that structural reforms bring long-term rewards. Much of its recent success reflects decisions after the financial crisis to reform its banks and labour market. The financial sector has consolidated, and labour market reforms have made it easier to renegotiate contracts and encourage bosses to take on more permanent staff. A package of measures aiming to boost renewables, including abolishing the sun tax that levied additional fees on solar power, has helped green energy boom. Still, Spain must not rest easy. Tourism and immigration are bidding up house prices. Investment and productivity growth remain elusive. An unwieldy and fragile coalition government is going in the wrong direction. It is unable to pass the further reforms needed to boost long-term growth, including in education and services. It is embracing fiddly regulations, driving up costs for businesses. It will need to find money to increase defence spending, which at just 1.3% of GDP is much too low. Spain shows that European economies can overcome seemingly insurmountable challenges. It must take care that it does not start to illustrate the danger of standing still.
Business.
Artificial intelligence. The next big thing. What do the gods of generative AI have in store for 2025?
The 12 days of Christmas are meant to start on December 25th, but not in the world of artificial intelligence, AI. On December 5th, OpenAI, maker of ChatGPT, began a blizzard of product shipments dubbed gratingly the 12 Days of Shipmas. It has included a full rollout of Sora, its video generation tool, as well as Canvas, a writing and coding product. Not to be outdone, Google has also put the elves to work early. On December 11th, it unveiled a new generative AI model called Gemini 2.0. And it launched souped-up prototypes of 2 AI products powered by the model called Astra and Mariner. These can take actions on a user's behalf, making them what industry types call agentic AI. The prominence of products over models in both sets of announcements was noteworthy. While the boffins who work on large language models are striving to get to the next frontier of intelligence, developers are under pressure to release clever products that prove there is a market for all this ingenuity. Developing generative AI products is fraught with difficulty. Product developers typically work backwards from what the consumer needs. Generative AI, however, is evolving so quickly that the technology is defining the product. You are normally taught not to be a hammer looking for a nail, says Kevin Weil, OpenAI's chief product officer. But every 2 months, computers can do something that we have never before been able to do. These latest product launches, though, have been marred by glitches. OpenAI had to suspend access to Sora shortly after it was released to ChatGPT subscribers because it underestimated demand, according to its boss, Sam Altman. Those who obtained access, even if impressed by what they found, noticed that problems from an earlier demo remained. One of the most glaring was the trouble the tool had portraying complex movements realistically. Marquez Brownlee, a tech reviewer, noted that Sora was almost guaranteed to mess up anything walking with 4 legs. Some objects also randomly disappeared. Google's agents were not fully polished either. Astra, which is currently available to only a small group of trusted testers, can explain in several languages what it sees through a phone's camera and had access to Google sites such as Search and Maps. In a demo that involved taking a video of famous paintings, it spoke knowledgeably about them. Yet it was flummoxed when asked by The Economist to name the city where most of the originals were on display. Mariner, Google's other new prototype, can complete tasks on a browser, such as filing a shopping basket in an online supermarket, but it cannot complete the checkout itself. Silicon Valley has great expectations for agentic AI in particular. The use of agents to advance from chatting to doing could be one of the big tech breakthroughs of 2025, says Alex Wang of Scale, an AI data company. Already that hope has bolstered the share prices of software giants like Salesforce. It said this month that it had struck deals with more than 200 customers for Agent Force, its workplace AI agent, within a week of releasing it in October. Microsoft, its bigger rival, has released a variety of AI agents. Several factors, however, make it harder to create agents than chatbots. One is data. Unlike chatbots, which scrape information from the web to answer questions, agents require data on the way tasks are performed, including the sequencing of actions and the reasoning behind them. For routine tasks such as processing a customer order, that may be straightforward. In many cases, though, it will be difficult to find sufficient data to train the tool. A second problem is trust. Checking whether a chatbot has given a right or wrong answer is usually easy. Determining whether an AI agent has booked the best restaurant or holiday it could within your budget may be more difficult. Google deliberately prevents Mariner from spending money in case it garbles the decision. Users may also balk at providing AI agents with sensitive information about, say, their purchase history, which may be required for the tools to function properly. A final problem is cost. In order to reason, plan, and solve problems on behalf of users, AI agents need access to models that can handle complex tasks. They also require low latency and the ability to interact with other tools such as a web browser, as well as plenty of memory to provide a service tailored to the user. All that is tricky and expensive to build and requires lots of computing power to run. Already, cost pressures are beginning to show. On December 5th, OpenAI launched a pro version of ChatGPT with unlimited access to all its latest bells and whistles at $200 a month, 10 times the price of its basic subscription. Alphabet, owner of Google, is as rich as Croesus and could choose to be more generous. Still, if agentic AI lives up to the hype, users may find it worth the extra cost.
International.
The future of the cow. Bridging the dairy divide. What has 4 stomachs and could change the world?
The average dairy cow in America produces 30 litres of milk a day. A cow in Africa only 1.6. This 19-fold difference, call it the dairy divide, has enormous consequences. Closing even some of it would ease poverty, help children grow up better nourished, reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, and perhaps even make civil wars less likely. The good news is that cows can become more productive thanks to the spread of technologies old and new. But unhelpful traditions, and climate change itself, make it harder. In rich countries, cows are unfashionable. The health-conscious are shunning red meat and switching to plant-based milk. The environmentally conscious fret correctly that cattle account for 7% of man-made greenhouse gas emissions, far more than any other kind of livestock. And techno-optimists have predicted, since the first lab-grown beef was unveiled in 2013, that cruelty-free cultured meat will replace the sort sliced from slaughtered animals as soon as it is cheap and tasty enough. Perhaps that day will come. But for now, cows are growing more important, not less so. The UN's Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO, expects global beef consumption to increase by 11% by 2033 and milk consumption to rise by 17% as the human population grows and more people can afford more animal protein. Farmers face 2 challenges. First, to meet growing demand for bovine bounty, even as hotter, less predictable weather makes their job harder in many regions. Second, to stop their cows from belching so much planet-cooking methane. In the first area, there has been impressive, albeit uneven, progress. In India, home of the world's largest herd, selective breeding and better husbandry increased the milk yield per cow from 3.8 litres a day in 2013 to 5.3 in 2022. The global rise was more modest, from 6.4 to 7.4 litres. Cattle in poor countries remain far behind their rich world peers, which means the opportunity for catch-up growth is enormous, says Dominic Visser of the FAO. Bovine emissions, alas, keep rising. Farmers have few incentives to abate them. Governments are loath to impose rules that might inflate food prices. Consumers are wary of methane-curbing feed additives such as Bovaer, and it is harder to monitor emissions from cows than, say, power stations, since there are 1.5 billion of them and their owners are often nomadic. Still, raising productivity, which farmers have every incentive to do, leads to lower emissions per glass of milk. One cow producing 10 litres a day emits much less methane than two producing 5 each, notes Sonia Leitner of the International Livestock Research Institute, or ILRI, in Nairobi. The FAO looked at 11 ways to cut bovine emissions. Raising productivity would be the key, ahead of tinkering with cows' genes and diets. The first steps are laughably low-tech. Alfred Kering, a smallholder near Eldoret in Kenya, raised each of his cows' daily output from 1 litre to 8, simply by reducing their number. He used to keep as many cattle as he could because, among his people, the Kalenjin, a man is judged by the size of his herd. The trouble was he didn't have enough land to feed all 10 of them properly. An agricultural extension officer suggested he sell some. Now he has only 3, but they are well fed and produce more than twice as much milk as the 10 did. He sells the surplus and is visibly less poor. His children are better fed and get sick less often, he says, and he no longer struggles to pay the school fees. The next step to raise productivity, selective breeding, is more sophisticated. One cannot simply take a high-yielding American cow, drop it in Africa and expect it to thrive. The heat and bugs would surely kill it. Farmers need hybrids that are good milkers but also resilient to local conditions. One snag is that smallholders like Mr. Kering typically keep no records of the bloodline of their cows. Some just hire the neighbour's bull when they need them impregnated, which fosters inbreeding and unhealthy offspring. Others have tried to create better hybrids, but are hampered by not knowing what they had to begin with. So since 2016, scientists at Africa Asia Dairy Genetic Gains, or AADGG, a project run by ILRI and backed by the Gates Foundation, have been gathering data on cow genetics and productivity in developing countries. They have plucked hairs from 15,000 cows in Ethiopia, Kenya and Tanzania and used the DNA to build a database of bovine genomes. In addition, AADGG works with a mobile app that lets farmers collect and relay data about each cow's milk, health, location, and so on. It then uses models to predict which genetic combinations might work best in specific places. At first it was hard to persuade smallholders to share information. Many thought it would be used to make them pay tax. But eventually, working with a firm called iCow, AADGG accustomed farmers to receiving advice digitally. Those enrolled in the project in Tanzania saw productivity rise by 50%. Gradually, know-how is spreading. Daniel Kemboi, another Kalenjin farmer, says he finds the right bull semen by Googling it. He browses a website that lets him select traits from higher milk yield to greater heat tolerance. His yield has risen from 12 to 15 litres per cow 5 years ago to 26. He has also built a cowshed for shade from soaring temperatures, a problem all local farmers complain about. He says he now makes 10 times as much money as he did when he drove a truck as a young man. Nationally, productivity per Kenyan dairy cow rose from 1.8 litres in 2013 to 2.3 in 2022. This is higher than the African average, but far short of what farmers in the AADGG project have shown is possible. It is also far short of what locals need. Some 35% of Kenyans are undernourished. Extra protein and iron, essential for brain development, would come in handy for them, and indeed for the 22% of the world's children under 5 who are stunted for lack of good food. A study by Beliu Haile and Derek Heddy of the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington found that an increase in milk consumption in a country was associated with a large reduction in stunting, even after controlling for income. The pressure to adapt is especially intense among nomadic herders. "We used to move from place to place following the rain," recalls Daniel Sinkit, a 59-year-old Maasai herdsman from southern Kenya. An intense drought in 2021 to 23 made him realise this way of life was not sustainable. When the local pasture dried up, he tried to save his cows the traditional way, by driving them on a 200-kilometre trek to find fresh grass and water, moving at night to avoid the heat. Many died of thirst or disease. He had to sell others at dismal prices to buy feed for the survivors. His herd shrank from 300 head to 200. If droughts grow more severe, conflicts between herders and sedentary farmers could proliferate. In good years, pastoralists graze their cows on marginal land until farmers have harvested their crops. Then, with the farmers' permission, they let their cows eat the stubble and pay the farmers in cash and cow dung. But when the rains fail, herders are forced to move before the harvest is in, and their cows often destroy unharvested crops. This can spark fights, which may escalate into ethnic conflict. A study by Owen McGurk of Tufts University and Nathan Nunn of Harvard found that drought in pastoral areas explained a sizable proportion of conflicts in Africa between 1989 and 2018, including civil wars. Mr. Sinkit has reluctantly concluded that the solution is to settle down. Instead of letting his cows wander far and wide, he now brings most of their food to them. He grows maize, alfalfa, and napier grass, and feeds it to them in troughs. It is a psychological wrench for him as a proud Maasai man to stop roaming, but if herders' productivity rises and they become more stationary, one of the big causes of war in Africa could eventually fade. Smallholders struggling to feed their kids seldom think much about their contribution to global warming, but ILRI is helping some countries come up with better estimates of bovine emissions, with a view to cutting them one day. In one experiment in Nairobi, cows were put in a metal box called a respiration chamber with instruments to measure how much methane they burp. Researchers are testing whether varying their diet with locally available legumes makes them produce more and emit less. Even rich countries do little to curb livestock emissions. A partial exception is the state of California, which has a target of reducing methane emissions to 40% below 2013 levels by 2030 and has crafted rules and subsidies to encourage farmers to do their bit. One technique is to capture the methane and sell it as fuel, which is less damaging than letting it float away. "That's just poop," says Simon van der Woude, a dairy farmer near Merced, near Sacramento, pointing to a duct filled with a thick brown liquid. Streams of water flush the dung from his 3,200 cows into a pit under a tarp. It is an anaerobic digester, a contraption that uses bacteria to break down biological waste into methane. Walking on the gas-filled tarp feels like jumping on a bulbous trampoline. The biogas is refined and sold. Before 2017, there were fewer than 20 digesters in California. Today, at least 149 are in operation or under construction. private companies offer to build and maintain digesters for a cut of the state subsidy and of the proceeds from selling the gas. Mr. van der Wilder's digester cost $4 million, but is now making a return. And there are other promising techniques. Studies suggest that adding red seaweed to cattle feed can suppress methane emissions, though estimates of how much vary widely. ST Genetics, a Texan firm, sells a tool to help farmers breed cows that make more milk while eating and thus emitting less. Pablo Ross, the firm's chief scientific officer, says there is still a lot of work to do to persuade farmers that this will save them money on feed without sacrificing other traits they want. If cow burps and farts were taxed in a way that reflected their baleful effect on the climate, farmers would have an incentive to curb them and consumers to cut back on emissions-heavy foods. In June, Denmark's government said it would slap a levy on emissions from livestock. So far, it is the only one.
Leaders.
What to make of 2024? A turbulent year has shed fresh light on some important truths.
Our pages have been full of suffering in 2024. War has raged on 3 continents. The world watched Gaza, Lebanon and Ukraine most closely, but the fighting in Sudan was the most deadly. Storms, tempests, floods and fires have ruined lives and taken them. All the while, the rivalry between countries siding with China and the American-led Western alliance has deepened, even as America has chosen as president a man whose commitment to that alliance is in doubt. At first sight, therefore, 2024 has amplified a growing sense that the multilateral order which emerged from the Second World War is coming apart. Increasingly, governments act as if might is right. Autocrats flout the rules, and the Western powers that preach them are accused of double standards. However, take a wider view, and 2024 holds a more hopeful message. It affirmed the resilience of capitalist democracies, including America's. At the same time, it laid bare some of the weaknesses of autocracies, including China. There is no easy road back to the old order. But world wars happen when rising powers challenge those in decline. American strength not only sets an example, it also makes conflict less likely. One measure of democratic resilience was how the year's elections led to peaceful political change. In 2024, 76 countries containing over half the world's population went to the ballot box, more than ever before. Not all elections are real. Russia's and Venezuela's were farcical. But as Britain showed when it turfed out the Conservatives after 14 years and 5 prime ministers, many were a rebuke to incumbents. Elections are a good way to avert bad outcomes. In India, in a raucous festival of democracy, the increasingly illiberal government of Narendra Modi had expected to enhance its dominance. Voters had other ideas. They wanted Mr. Modi to focus less on Hindu nationalism and more on their standard of living, and they steered him into a coalition. In South Africa, the African National Congress lost its majority. Instead of rejecting the result, as many liberation movements have, it chose to govern with the reform-minded Democratic Alliance. In America, the year began amid warnings of election violence. Donald Trump's clear victory meant America escaped that fate. That is a low bar, but Americans may now not face such perilous circumstances for many years, in which time its politics will evolve. The fact that so many African Americans and Hispanics voted Republican suggests that the Democrats' divisive and losing politics of identity has peaked. The enduring nature of America's power was visible in the economy too. Since 2020, it has grown at 3 times the pace of the rest of the G7. In 2024, the S&P 500 index rose by over 20%. In recent decades, China's economy has been catching up, but nominal GDP has fallen from about 3/4 the size of America's at its peak in 2021 to 2/3 today. This success is partly thanks to pandemic-inspired government spending, but the fundamental reason is the dynamism of the private sector. Along with America's huge market, this is a magnet for capital and talent. No other economy is better placed to create and profit from revolutionary technologies like biotech, advanced materials, and especially artificial intelligence, where its lead is astounding. Were it not for growing protectionism, America's prospects would be even brighter. Contrast all that with China. Its authoritarian model of economic management will have fewer admirers after 2024, when it became clear that the country's slowdown is not just cyclical, but the product of its political system. President Xi Jinping has resisted a consumer stimulus for fear of too much debt and because he sees consumerism as a distraction from the rivalry with America. Instead, he instructs young people to eat bitterness. Rather than have his country's disappointing economic performance on display, he has preferred to censor statistics, though flying blind leads to worse economic decisions. The failings of authoritarianism have been even clearer in Russia. It now has the advantage over Ukraine on the battlefield, but its gains are slow and costly. At home, inflation is mounting, and resources that should have been invested in Russia's future are being wasted on war. In a free society, Vladimir Putin would have paid for his ruinous aggression. Even if the fighting stops in 2025, Russians seem stuck with him. Attempts to change the world by force are hard to sustain, as Iran has affirmed. With Russia, it spent billions of dollars to keep Bashar al-Assad in power in Syria after an uprising was about to topple him in 2011. As Iran's economy buckled and sentiment hardened against its foreign mischief-making, the mullahs in Tehran could no longer afford to prop up a dictator whose subjects had rejected him. The victory for people power in Syria came after Hamas and Hezbollah, both Iranian proxies, had been crippled by Israel. Democracies have vulnerabilities too. This is clearest in Europe, where the political centre is crumbling as governments fail to grapple with Russian aggression and their weakness in the industries of the future. If Europe fades, America will also suffer, though Mr. Trump may not see it that way. And many questions hang over Mr. Trump. Iran's retreat and the promise of a ceasefire in Gaza give him a chance to forge relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia, and even to find an accommodation with Iran. He could also oversee a peace that gives Ukraine a chance to escape Russia's orbit. Yet risks abound. Markets have priced in Muskian deregulation and AI-propelled growth. If Mr. Trump becomes mired in cronyism or pursues mass deportation, persecutes his enemies, and wages a trade war in earnest rather than for show, his presidency will do grave harm. Indeed, those risks were worrying enough for The Economist to endorse Kamala Harris. We still worry today. Assume, though, that Mr. Trump opts against self-sabotage. In 2025 and beyond, technological and political change will continue to create remarkable opportunities for human progress. In 2024, democracies showed that they are built to take advantage of those opportunities by sacking bad leaders, jettisoning obsolete ideas, and choosing new priorities. That process is often messy, but it is a source of enduring strength.
Finance and economics.
Winners and losers. Podium places. Which economy did best in 2024? Our annual rankings provide an answer.
Interest rates at their highest in decades, wars in Europe and the Middle East, elections in countries as important as America and India. No matter, the world economy delivered another strong performance in 2024. According to the IMF, global GDP will grow by 3.2%. Inflation has eased and employment growth remains solid. Stock markets have risen by more than 20% for a second consecutive year. Yet, as ever, the rosy global picture conceals wide variation between countries. To assess these differences, we have compiled data on 5 economic and financial indicators: GDP, stock market performance, core inflation, unemployment and government deficits for 37 mostly rich countries. We then ranked each economy based on its performance to create a combined score. Who are the winners? The Mediterranean's rally rolls on for the 3rd consecutive year, with Spain at the top of this year's list. Greece and Italy, once emblematic of the Eurozone's woes, continue their recoveries. Ireland, which has attracted tech firms, and Denmark, home to Novo Nordisk of Ozempic fame, round out the top 5. Meanwhile, the Northern European heavyweights disappoint, with poor performances from Britain and Germany. The Baltic duo of Latvia and Estonia find themselves back at the bottom, a position they also occupied in 2022. Our first indicator is real GDP growth, widely regarded as the most reliable measure of an economy's overall health. This year, global GDP was buoyed by the resilient American economy and its free-spending consumers. Israel emerged as another standout performer, according to OECD data, though its strong growth largely reflects a rebound from a sharp contraction in the final quarter of 2023, when its fight with Hamas began. In Spain, annual GDP growth is on track to exceed 3%, driven by a strong labour market and high levels of immigration, which mechanically lift economic output. Although the country's GDP per person has also risen, it has done so by less than overall GDP. Elsewhere, growth has been underwhelming. Germany and Italy have been hampered by high energy prices and sluggish manufacturing industries. Japan is set to post a meagre 0.2% growth, weighed down by weaker tourism and a struggling car industry. Hungary and Latvia have both slipped into recession. Our second measure is stock market returns. Investors shrugged off a rocky August when the unwinding of the yen carry trade prompted fears of a crisis. American equities have delivered impressive inflation-adjusted returns of 24%, as valuations for tech firms, already lofty, climbed higher. Canada's market, closely linked to its southern neighbour, also posted healthy gains, bolstered by strong performances in the energy and banking industries. Japan's Nikkei 225 hit a record high, even if its overall annual performance was middling. There were some losers. Share prices in Finland are in negative territory in real terms, and South Korea's stock market tumbled in the wake of an attempted autogolpe by the president on December 3rd. Next, we turn to core inflation, which strips out volatile components such as energy and food to indicate underlying price pressures. Although global inflation has fallen significantly, prices of services remain high in many countries. In Britain, wage growth continues to drive up services costs, meaning core inflation is uncomfortably elevated. In Australia, rising housing costs are in part to blame. Inflation in Turkey remains sizzling. By contrast, France and Switzerland have managed to keep price pressures in check. A classic marker of economic misery is rising unemployment, which is what many predicted when central bankers began to raise interest rates and artificial intelligence grew more sophisticated. Yet despite some loosening, labour markets remain robust, with unemployment rates near record lows. Southern Europe, which still suffers from high unemployment, has seen remarkable improvement. Joblessness in Greece, Italy and Spain has fallen to its lowest in over a decade. Italy has enjoyed the most progress, with joblessness dropping by 1.4 percentage points since the start of the year. In America and Canada, where unemployment has ticked up slightly, the trend is largely attributable to the fact that people are returning to the labour force and to high levels of immigration. One final measure looks at fiscal balances, excluding interest payments as a share of GDP. After years of big spending, consolidation is required in many countries to ensure that debt burdens remain manageable. Denmark and Portugal stand out for achieving rare budget surpluses through fiscal discipline. Norway and Ireland also boast surpluses, though for other reasons. Norway owing to oil revenues and Ireland to a corporate tax windfall bolstered by a multi-billion-dollar back tax payment from Apple, a tech giant. Most governments, however, continue to spend with abandon. Poland's primary deficit exceeded 3% of GDP, owing to a rise in defence spending in response to Russia's war in Ukraine. In Japan, hefty fiscal stimulus aimed at propping up the economy and easing cost of living pressures risks compounding debt problems as an era of ultra-low interest rates comes to an end. Britain's debt trajectory is deteriorating. Its latest budget failed to repair the public finances. France is mired in political turmoil and unable to restrain spending. As 2025 comes into view, the global economy faces new challenges. Nearly half the world's population lives in countries that held elections this year, many of which ushered in leaders who might be described as unpredictable. Trade is under threat, government debt is swelling, and stock markets have little room for error. For now, at least, Spain, Greece and Italy, long belittled by their northern neighbours, can celebrate their economic resurgence. They deserve a fiesta.
China.
Languages. English fever wanes. Why China is showing less interest in learning the world's lingua franca.
In preparation for the Summer Olympics in 2008, the authorities in Beijing, the host city and China's capital, launched a campaign to teach English to residents likely to come in contact with foreign visitors. Police, transit workers and hotel staff were among those targeted. One aim was to have 80% of taxi drivers achieve a basic level of competency. Today, though, any foreigner visiting Beijing will notice that rather few people are able to speak English well. The 80% target proved a fantasy. Most drivers still speak nothing but Chinese. Even the public-facing staff at the city's main international airport struggle to communicate with foreigners. Immigration officers often resort to computer translation systems. For much of the 40 years since China began opening up to the world, English fever was a common catchphrase. People were eager to learn foreign languages, English most of all. Many hoped the skill would lead to jobs with international firms. Others wanted to do business with foreign companies. Some dreamt of moving abroad. But enthusiasm for learning English has waned in recent years. According to one ranking by EF Education First, an international language training firm, China ranks 91st among 116 countries and regions in terms of English proficiency. Just 4 years ago, it ranked 38th out of 100. Over that time, its rating has slipped from moderate to low proficiency. Some in China question the accuracy of the EF index, but others note that this apparent trend is happening when China is also growing more insular. During the COVID-19 pandemic, for example, China shut its borders. Officials and businessmen, let alone ordinary citizens, made few trips abroad. Long after the rest of the world began opening up, China remained closed. At the same time, China's relations with the world's biggest English-speaking countries soured. Trade wars and diplomatic tiffs strained its ties with America, Australia, Britain and Canada. The mood is such that legislators and school administrators have tried to limit the amount of time devoted to the study of English and to reduce the weight given to it on China's all-important university entrance exams. In 2022, a lawmaker proposed de-emphasizing the language in order to boost the teaching of traditional Chinese subjects. The Education Ministry demurred, but a professor at one of China's elite universities says many students consider English less important than it used to be and are less interested in learning it. As China's economy slows, people have become more cautious and inward-looking. Today, fewer Chinese are travelling abroad than before the pandemic. Young people are less keen on jobs requiring English, choosing instead to pursue dull but secure work in the public sector. Then there are translation apps, which are improving at a rapid pace and becoming more ubiquitous. The tools may be having an effect outside China too. The EF rankings show that tech-savvy Japan and South Korea have also been losing ground when it comes to English proficiency. Why spend time learning a new language when your phone is already fluent in it?